Chapter 1. You're going to marry him. For all of us. The Harrington mansion was carved from polished silence and cold marble, the kind of place that echoed with money and secrets. But Harry wasn't there yet. He sat stiffly on the velvet couch in the living room of his adoptive family's estate, hands tucked neatly into his lap, eyes lowered as if afraid to meet the gilded chandelier's gaze. The floor beneath his shoes was glassy and expensive, reflecting his pale, almost too delicate features. His dark curls framed his face like a shadowed halo, and his eyes, large, brown, expressive, were the kind that begged to be treated gently. But no one in that room had ever treated Harry gently. Across from him sat his father, Gregor Alden, all sharp edges and tailored suits, nursing a glass of something amber and powerful. His mother, Lorraine, perched beside him in pearls and distaste, eyes cold as winter hailstones. And his older brother, Mason, lounged against the wall with his usual smirk, the one that made Harry feel like an insect under a microscope. Lorraine's voice broke the silence. "You're going to marry Cole Harrington." Harry blinked. For a moment he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "I'm sorry?" "You heard her," Gregor said, setting his drink down with a dull thunk. "It's been arranged. You'll be married next week." He stared at them, heart beginning to pound. "But why? I don't even know him." Mason snorted. "You don't need to know him, Harry. You just need to play your part." Harry's chest tightened. "But I'm still in school. I have exams. I was supposed to." "We've paid for everything you have," Lorraine said icily. "The clothes on your back, the tuition, the roof over your head. Do you really think those things were free?" And there it was, the quiet debt they always reminded him of. Harry bit the inside of his cheek, hard. Gregor leaned forward. "Cole Harrington is a billionaire. Ruthless. Guarded. Doesn't trust a soul. Which makes him vulnerable. He needs to marry to access his grandfather's inheritance. He's desperate, and willing to pay." "He's offering $5 million, Mason added, his voice low and greedy. "Up front, double that if the marriage lasts the year." Harry's mouth went dry. "$5 million? 10? Gregor continued, "We want you to get close to him, gain his trust, and when the time is right, help us access what we need. Business records, insider details, whatever you can get." I can't steal from him," Harry whispered. "You can and you will," Lorraine snapped. "This family took you in when no one else wanted you. We gave you a name. You owe us." I'm not even your real son," he said before he could stop himself. His voice cracked at the end. "Exactly," Mason said, walking over. He crouched beside the couch, fake sympathy in his eyes. "You're not one of us, Harry, but you could be useful." Harry's throat felt too tight to speak. He stared down at his trembling hands. His dreams of a quiet life, of falling in love with someone who cherished him, of finishing his degree, of being someone, shattered one by one, like fragile glass underfoot. No one asked him if he wanted this. No one ever did. "I'll do it," he murmured. The room exhaled. In another corner of the city, the Harrington Tower loomed like a dark monolith in the skyline, its top floors glinting with power and ice. Cole Harrington sat in his glass-walled office, a quiet storm in a black suit. 33 years old, tall and broad, with the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers and wanted posters alike. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, short black hair styled with ruthless precision. His blue eyes could slice through granite. The man across from him, a graying lawyer named Adam, tapped a stack of papers. "You have 1 week, Cole." Cole arched a brow. 1 week to what? Fall in love? Have a child? "To get married," Adam said simply. "The board and your grandfather's estate are very clear. No spouse, no inheritance." Cole leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the leather armrest. "I suppose I could marry you, Adam. You've always had such a warm smile." Adam didn't blink. "You need someone agreeable. Quiet. Harmless. Someone who won't demand anything except a paycheck." Cole's smirk faded slightly. "So a contract marriage." Adam slid a sleek tablet across the table. "I've already narrowed it down. These are all pre-screened candidates. Most of them come from families that could use the financial boost. They'll agree to the terms. 1 year. Discretion. Divorce after the inheritance is secured." Cole scrolled through the faces. Smiling men, posed men, men with ambition in their eyes. And then he paused. A boy with wide brown eyes and a fragile kind of beauty. His expression wasn't seductive or proud. He looked like someone trying not to breathe too loudly. "Name, Harry Alden. Age 21. Cole stared at the image for a long moment. "This one," he said finally. Adam blinked. "You're sure? He's very young." "He looks obedient," Cole replied coolly. "I don't want a partner. I want silence. I want space. He won't get in the way." Adam hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. I'll arrange the marriage license. The Aldens are eager." Cole turned his chair to face the city skyline. His reflection ghosted against the glass, lonely, unreachable. "It's just a year," he murmured. "Then it's over." The wedding was small, sleek, clinical. Held in the Harrington family's private estate garden, it had all the hallmarks of money and none of the warmth of love. Journalists weren't allowed. Guests were limited to a select handful of shareholders and legal witnesses. Even the flowers were white and emotionless. Harry stood at the altar in a pale cream suit that clung gently to his frame, his skin almost luminous against the fabric. His curls had been neatly styled, and a soft pink touched his cheeks, though whether from makeup or sheer nerves was unclear. He looked like a porcelain doll someone had left out in the cold. Cole arrived late. When he stepped out of the black car, time stilled. Every head turned. He was dressed in all black. Black suit, black tie, black cufflinks, and when he walked, the air seemed to bend around him. Power, money, control. Harry saw him and nearly forgot to breathe. Cole's eyes swept the ceremony and finally landed on Harry. Something flickered across his face. He hadn't expected him to be this beautiful. Not fragile in a fake way. Just real. Breakable. Their eyes locked. Harry looked away first. When the officiant began the vows, Harry's voice trembled. "I do." Cole, ever composed, repeated the words like a businessman signing a contract. But when he slipped the ring onto Harry's finger, his hand lingered just a second too long. The kiss was brief and cool, a brush of lips more than anything else, yet Harry felt it down to his bones. His heart was pounding for all the wrong reasons. When the ceremony ended, Cole offered him his arm. Harry hesitated, then took it. It was done. He was no longer just Harry Alden. He was Harry Harrington. And as they stepped into the car that would take them to their shared new life, Harry couldn't stop the thought that echoed through his head. This isn't love. It's a sentence. But Cole, staring out the window, had a different thought entirely. This should be easy. So why does he already look like something I'll break without meaning to? Chapter 2. We Don't Have to Pretend at Home. The mansion they moved into wasn't a home. It was a statement. Perched high above the city, the Harrington estate looked more like a glass museum than a place two people were meant to live. Floor-to-ceiling windows, silent hallways, cold steel surfaces. Not a speck of warmth to be found anywhere. The kind of place where echoes sounded lonely instead of loud. Harry stood at the doorway, suitcase in hand, staring up at the building like it might swallow him whole. Cole barely glanced over his shoulder. "Come in." Harry followed him wordlessly, his polished shoes clicking too loudly against the marble floors. His fingers clutched the handle of his suitcase tighter as they moved through the main hall, past abstract art pieces, sleek furniture with sharp corners, and no sign of anything lived in. No photos. No mess. No color. Just like Cole. Cole finally stopped outside a door on the second floor. "This is your room," he said, pushing it open. "There's a study next to it if you need to work. My room is at the end of the hall. We don't have to pretend in here. Not with anyone watching." Harry nodded, still holding onto the handle of his suitcase like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I won't touch you," Cole added. His voice was blunt, clipped. "You have your space. I have mine. Just follow the rules, don't cause problems, and this will be over in a year." Harry looked up at him slowly. Cole's face was unreadable. "Yes," Harry whispered, "I understand." Cole turned and walked away without another word. The first few days settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite life, but wasn't death either. Harry didn't explore much. He spent his days between his bedroom, the study, and the library, which was the only place in the mansion that felt remotely human. Rows of books, soft armchairs, and a faint scent of leather and dust. He was quiet. Always. Too quiet, in fact. Cole noticed that quickly. Noticed the way Harry moved like he was trying not to exist. How he never spoke unless spoken to. How he didn't seem to eat unless someone placed food directly in front of him. The first night, Harry made tea for both of them. He didn't ask. Just quietly placed a cup on the kitchen island and disappeared back into his room. Cole didn't drink it. The second night, he did. By the fourth night, the tea had become a silent ritual. Harry placing it at the counter at exactly 8 p.m., Cole drinking it without comment. No thanks, no praise. But he drank it. It was, Harry supposed, the closest thing they had to communication. The housekeeper arrived on the fifth day. Her name was Monica, and she exploded into the sterile mansion like a glitter bomb someone had set off in a courtroom. She was in her late 40s, short and round, with wildly curly red hair and the kind of earrings that jingled when she turned her head. She carried grocery bags in both arms, humming off key, and greeted Cole like he was a misbehaving nephew. "Well, this place still looks like a bank lobby," she muttered, dropping bags on the kitchen counter. "No color, no soul. If you weren't so damn rich, I'd call this a crime scene." Cole barely spared her a glance. "Good morning, Monica." She looked up and saw Harry, and paused. Her eyes softened in an instant. She walked over, hands on hips, and gave him the once-over that only maternal women and war generals could do properly. "And you must be the new husband." Harry's cheeks flushed. "Yes, ma'am." "Oh, ma'am," he says, she huffed. "You're already my favorite. Look at you. Skinny as a stick, poor thing. Do you even eat?" Harry gave a polite little smile and didn't answer. Monica made a disapproving noise in the back of her throat. "Cole, I hope you're not starving the boy." "I'm not starving anyone," Cole said dryly. Monica muttered, squinting at him. "We'll see." Over the next few days, she made it her personal mission to meddle. She accidentally left dinner plates set for 2 instead of 1. She baked cookies and told Harry to deliver them to Cole's office. She made a show of talking about love being hard work. Always in earshot, always with a wink. Cole ignored her. Harry didn't know what to do with her. But for the first time since the wedding, he laughed. Only once. And very quietly. One night, Cole walked into the kitchen to find Harry standing on his tiptoes, trying to reach a mug from the top shelf. He wore a soft, oversized sweater and thin cotton pants, the sleeves swallowing his hands. His hair was damp from a shower, curls sticking to the sides of his face. Cole didn't say a word, just reached over him and grabbed the mug without effort. He held it out silently. Harry blinked up at him. "Thank you." Cole nodded and stepped back. Their fingers hadn't touched, but something about the moment lingered in the air like steam. That night, Cole ordered 3 different dishes from Harry's favorite restaurant. He didn't tell him, just left them on the counter beside the tea. Harry stared at the containers when he came down. Opened one. His eyes widened, then another, and another. He sat down and ate slowly, quietly, savoring every bite. He didn't say anything, but Cole noticed the next day when Harry left a tiny folded note next to the tea. "Thank you." In soft, curved handwriting. Nothing else. Later that week, the storm hit. Not outside. Inside Harry. He'd held it together for longer than he thought possible. But the weight of everything, the fake marriage, the manipulation, the betrayal of his own dreams, finally cracked him open. It started with a simple shower. Just hot water. A quiet evening. Nothing unusual. But then he sank down onto the tile floor, hugged his knees to his chest, and sobbed. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quiet, hopeless crying. The kind that came from a deep, lonely part of him that had waited years for someone to choose him. Love him. Just once. He pressed his face into his arms and wished, just for a second, that he'd never been born into that awful family. That he hadn't agreed to this. That he'd never seen Cole's cold blue eyes or walked into this museum of a mansion. He cried until the water ran cold. Upstairs, Cole heard everything. He'd been walking past the bathroom when the sound stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought Harry had slipped. But then he heard the small, choked gasps, the broken breaths, and then silence. He stood there for a long time, listening, his fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't knock, didn't open the door. Instead, when Harry finally came out, eyes red, skin pale, sweater sleeves damp, he found his room exactly the way he left it, except for one thing. Folded neatly on the floor beside his door was a thick, soft blanket. Navy blue, brand new, still smelled like clean cotton, no note, no explanation, just warmth. Harry picked it up slowly, clutching it to his chest. He didn't cry again that night, but he didn't sleep either, because for the first time since the marriage, something shifted. The mansion was still cold, the silence still heavy, but Harry thought, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone. Chapter 3. Do you ever think about what you really want? Harry's alarm buzzed at precisely 6:30 a.m., cutting through the silence of his room like a blade. He reached out with a sleepy hand and turned it off, blinking up at the ceiling of his enormous impersonal bedroom. The walls were white, the shelves pristine, the window too large. Nothing in the space belonged to him. Not really. Not even the marriage that put him here. But school? That still felt like his. He showered, dressed in a soft gray sweater and jeans, and gathered his things quietly. By the time he crept downstairs, the house was still. Cole was either asleep or already at work. Probably the latter. Harry paused briefly in the kitchen, scribbled a note, "Good morning. Tea's on the stove," and left it beside a warm mug before slipping out the door with his backpack slung over one shoulder. The university campus was a welcome change. No marble floors, no glass walls. Just noise and students and the comforting smell of too much coffee and paper. He kept his head down, found his lecture hall, and took a seat near the back. His classmates barely noticed him. That was fine. He liked it better that way. The class was advanced thermofluids. Most students groaned when the professor walked in with a long, complex equation written across the board. "This," the professor announced, "is the simplified model of the Navier-Stokes equation applied to compressible flows. I want you to solve for the velocity gradient at the boundary layer, assuming turbulent flow and variable viscosity. Anyone up for the challenge?" Silence. A few students shifted in their seats. One girl tried to suppress a groan. Harry didn't raise his hand. He never did. But his pen moved quickly over his notebook, almost absent-mindedly, translating numbers and symbols into shapes and patterns that made sense to him. He liked the way equations fit together, like puzzles, like music. The professor walked the room, pausing when he passed Harry's desk. He leaned down, brow furrowing as he studied the page. "This is correct," he said, more surprised than anything. Harry looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't mean, I was just trying something." "Trying something?" The professor laughed. "You solved a graduate-level equation in under 4 minutes." A few students turned to stare. Harry's ears burned. He looked down, hiding behind his hair. After class, several people approached him, asking how he did it, where he learned, if he was some kind of math genius. Harry just smiled, soft and small, and excused himself. He didn't want to be seen. He just wanted to belong. Back at the mansion, chaos simmered beneath the polished floors. Cole stood at the center of his office, jaw tight, voice like steel. His tech team had gathered around the massive screen on the far wall, which flashed with warnings in red and white. "Someone accessed our client files through a back door in the payment system," his head of security explained. "No major losses yet, but it's a vulnerability. They slipped in through an old integration we didn't patch. We're trying to locate the entry point." "Trying?" Cole's voice dropped. "We don't try. We fix. I don't want this happening again." The team dispersed after a while, and Cole sat at his desk, fuming quietly. He didn't trust half the people he paid. Paranoia came with the territory. The only reason the Harrington Empire hadn't collapsed from the inside was because he trusted no one. Not with his business. Not with his life. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd barely noticed it was already dark outside. Monica noticed. Harry was in the kitchen again, boiling water for their evening tea, when she leaned on the counter beside him and said, "He's in a foul mood." Harry glanced up, startled. "Cole?" Yelling into phones, cursing at emails. I nearly tripped over 3 terrified interns on my way out." She paused, then gave him a sideways look. "He's got a data problem. Something about hackers." Harry frowned. "A data breach?" That's the word he used. Wouldn't tell me more, of course, but it looked serious. That night, after the tea was set on the counter like always, Harry returned to his room. But he didn't go to bed. He sat at his desk, laptop open, and pulled up an article about a recent cyber vulnerability in older financial software APIs, exactly the kind a high-profile firm might still use. He read through the exploit documentation and, without thinking too much, scribbled a few lines of suggestion on a folded piece of paper. A patch suggestion. A reroute protocol. He didn't sign it. Just folded it twice and slipped it under Cole's office door. Then he went to bed. The next morning, Cole stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, coffee in hand, reading the note. At first, he assumed it was from one of his team leads. Then he realized it wasn't. There was no signature. No company letterhead. but the writing was clear. The suggestion, rerouting through a proxy layer and isolating the breach before removing the back door, was brilliant. It worked. The breach was contained before noon, and Cole was stunned. He stared at the note for a long time before placing it in his drawer. He didn't ask Harry about it. But that evening he sat down at the dinner table instead of eating in his office. Harry noticed. He paused in the kitchen, blinking. Did you want something? Cole looked up. I thought we could eat. Together. Harry hesitated. All right. They sat at the long table, too many chairs between them, the food arranged like a photo shoot. Monica had outdone herself again. Stuffed roasted vegetables, warm garlic bread, something with creamy sauce and herbs. Harry ate slowly, quietly. Cole did too. Halfway through, Harry looked up and said softly, Did the problem get fixed? Cole's fork paused. Yes, it did. Harry nodded. Good. A stretch of silence. Then Harry tilted his head, curious. Do you ever think about what you really want? Cole looked at him, and for a second the air changed. Not in a dramatic way. Not in an explosive romantic way. Just quieter. Like two people holding a secret between them. Cole studied him. Harry's expression wasn't sharp or challenging, just soft, thoughtful. What I want, Cole said finally, has never mattered much. Harry lowered his eyes. Maybe it should. Cole didn't reply. But the question followed him for the rest of the night. He began to see things after that. Small things. Harry curled up on the living room couch with a book in his lap, blanket tucked around his legs like a cocoon. The way he smiled to himself while reading. How he tucked his chin when someone raised their voice, like he expected to be punished. The way he looked up at the stars every night through the giant library window, as if they held answers no one on earth could give him. Cole saw it all, and he hated that it made him feel anything. He wasn't supposed to care. This was a business arrangement, but caring didn't ask for permission. A week later, Mason showed up. Harry wasn't expecting him. Monica called up from the intercom, saying someone from his family had arrived, and Harry's stomach twisted into knots. He met him in the driveway, away from Cole's view. Mason got out of his sleek black car wearing sunglasses and arrogance. You've been quiet. Harry crossed his arms. I didn't know I was supposed to report in. You are, Mason said. Dad wants updates. Where's the business info? Access codes? You haven't even asked for his login credentials yet. Harry felt sick. He's not careless. He doesn't leave things out. Then earn his trust, Mason said coldly. That's your job. You live in his house. Sleep in his bed. What exactly are you doing all day? Making tea? Harry said nothing. Mason stepped forward, face tightening. You think he'll love you or something? He's a billionaire, Harry. You're a charity case. Don't forget who you are. Harry flinched. The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. You're not part of their world, Mason hissed. Get what we need, or we'll make sure you lose everything. Then he got in his car and drove away. Harry stood there for a long time, staring after him. Later that night, he sat beside the library window, blanket pulled around him, knees to his chest, staring at the stars with tired eyes. He felt the lie like a stone in his throat. He hated it. He hated them. And worst of all, he hated that he didn't want to betray Cole anymore. Chapter 4. If you're going to cry, cry in front of me. The storm rolled in just after midnight. Not one that howled through the city or sent lightning cracking across the sky. This one brewed quietly inside the Harrington mansion behind closed doors and under cold white sheets. Cole never got sick. That was something he'd said himself on more than one occasion, usually with that cold, confident smirk as if his immune system was just as ruthless as he was. But that night, he staggered out of his office looking pale and drenched in sweat, shirt clinging to his back, footsteps slow and unsteady. His breath was shallow, and the edges of his vision blurred. When he reached the stairs, he gripped the railing like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Harry found him moments later, halfway to his room. Cole? He asked, voice laced with confusion. He hadn't expected to see him. Especially not like this. Cole didn't answer. He swayed once, then again, and then his knees buckled. Harry rushed forward, barely catching him by the arm. You're burning up, he whispered, trying to support his weight. Can you walk? I'm fine, Cole muttered, but his voice was weak and rasping, and he couldn't stand straight. It took effort to get him into bed. Cole fought it at first, stubborn even when he could barely speak. But his body gave up before his pride did, and within minutes he was collapsed against the pillows, skin flushed red with fever. Harry sat beside him, panic fluttering in his chest. He grabbed a basin and cloth from the bathroom, filled it with cool water, and returned to the bedroom. The mansion felt colder than usual, like even the walls had gone quiet out of respect. Harry dipped the cloth and pressed it gently to Cole's forehead. "You're okay," he whispered, dabbing sweat from his temple. "You'll be okay." He stayed that way for hours. Through the night, he changed the cloth, adjusted the blankets, whispered words he didn't know Cole could even hear. He coaxed sips of water between cracked lips and placed a hand on Cole's chest now and then, just to make sure it was still rising. Around 3 in the morning, Harry's body gave in. He curled up carefully beside Cole, too exhausted to make it back to his own room, head resting near Cole's shoulder, fingers tangled in the blanket. He was asleep before he even realized it. Cole woke sometime before dawn. He didn't remember much, just flashes of heat and cold and the softest voice coaxing him out of a fevered haze. Now, with his eyes open and the pain in his skull dulling, he felt the weight of something warm beside him. He turned his head. Harry was curled against him, still in his pajamas, curls messy and face soft with sleep. His lashes brushed his cheeks. One hand rested on Cole's arm, like he'd fallen asleep mid-care. Cole stared at him for a long time, longer than he should have, and something unfamiliar lodged itself in his chest. He didn't understand it, didn't have a name for it, but he didn't move. By morning, Harry stirred. He blinked sleepily, sitting up slowly and brushing hair from his eyes. "You're awake." Cole's voice was hoarse. "Barely." Harry reached for the cloth again. "You scared me." Cole's gaze lingered on him. "Why did you stay?" Harry hesitated, wringing the cloth in his hands. Then, softly, "Because I care." The words settled between them, gentle but powerful, and Cole looked at him as if Harry had just lit a match in a dark room. Harry looked down. "Sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Cole didn't speak. His throat was dry for reasons unrelated to the fever. He watched Harry fuss with the blanket, straighten the pillows, avoid his eyes. He felt that same strange thing twist inside him. And it terrified him. The next few days were quiet. Cole recovered quickly, of course he did, but something shifted in him. Subtle but steady. He stopped answering his phone during dinner, canceled an overseas trip his assistant had already booked, stopped bringing anyone home. He didn't explain any of it, but Monica noticed. And Monica always noticed. She cornered him in the kitchen one morning, arms folded across her chest, eyebrow arched. "You've been acting strange lately." Cole looked up from his espresso machine. "I'm fine." "You're not snapping at the cleaning staff." "I'm still snapping at you." "You haven't gone out in a week." Cole turned to face her fully. "What do you want, Monica?" She stepped closer, voice quieter now. "He's falling in love with you, you know." Cole stiffened. "You think I don't see it?" She went on. "The way he looks at you, like he wants to believe this is real, like he needs it to be real. And you don't scare him. Not like you scare everyone else. That boy would walk barefoot through glass if he thought it would make you smile." "He shouldn't," Cole said, his voice sharp and cold. Monica didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But he does." She left the room before he could reply. And Cole stood there for a long time, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in his hand, as if it might offer him an answer. That afternoon, Harry got a message. One of those ominous, "we need to talk" texts from his adoptive mother. The kind he never ignored, because ignoring them came with consequences. So he went. Mason was there, of course. So was his father. The conversation was cold and quick. "You're taking too long," Gregor snapped. "This was supposed to be simple." Mason leaned forward. "You're living with the guy. What's the holdup? You should have found a way to get into his financials by now." Harry's stomach churned. "He's private. I don't have access to." "Then find a way," Mason hissed. "Stop playing house and do what we sent you to do." Lorraine didn't say much, just watched him with that distant disgust she always wore when she looked at him too long, like she regretted every penny she'd spent feeding him. Harry left their home, feeling hollow, like a ghost wearing someone else's skin. It was nearly midnight when he returned to the mansion. He didn't go inside right away. Just slipped through the garden gate and sat on the stone bench near the fountain. The lights from the house were dim and far away. Out here, it was easier to breathe. His hands trembled in his lap. He hated lying, hated the ache in his chest when Cole looked at him like he trusted him, like he mattered. He didn't matter. Not to anyone, not really. Tears gathered in his eyes before he could stop them, and then spilled over. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, trying not to sob too loudly. "I just wanted to be loved," he whispered to no one. "I'm so tired of being used." The voice that answered him made him jump. "Then stop hiding when you cry." Harry spun around. Cole stood a few feet away, barefoot, dressed in soft sleep clothes that looked almost human on him instead of godlike. His arms were crossed, but his eyes were gentle, quiet. "I wasn't hiding," Harry lied. Cole stepped closer. "You were." Harry looked down, ashamed. "I didn't want to bother you." "You're my husband," Cole said softly. "You're allowed to bother me." Harry let out a trembling breath. You don't know what it's like." Cole sat beside him, careful not to touch. "Then tell me." Harry shook his head. "You wouldn't get it." "I want to," Cole said. That broke something open. Harry turned to him, eyes wet and bright. "They never loved me. I was just there. A charity project. And now I'm just a tool, a means to an end. I thought maybe this could be something. Not love, but safe. And I can't even have that." Cole didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, pulled Harry into his arms slowly, carefully, like he was afraid to break him. Harry froze, then melted. He clung to Cole's shirt and cried against his chest, the sound muffled but raw, and Cole just held him. No questions, no demands. Just warmth, just silence. Just arms around a boy who'd never been held like that before. And for the first time since the day of their wedding, Harry felt the faintest flicker of something that might someday become home. Chapter 5. You're Not Going Anywhere. Cole hated business trips. They were all polished smiles and forced handshakes, fake laughter in conference rooms with men who smelled like money and fear. But this one, a 3-day summit in Geneva, was too important to skip. His company was entering a joint venture with a European conglomerate, and his presence was required. So when he stood at the foot of the staircase and called up to Harry, "Pack a bag, you're coming with me," he made sure his voice was impersonal. "For image," he added quickly. "The press will be there." But that wasn't the real reason. Harry appeared at the landing in a soft blue sweater and jeans, his hair still damp from the shower. "Are you sure?" Cole didn't meet his eyes. "It'll look suspicious if you stay behind." Harry nodded, not pushing further. He never did. The private jet was sleek, quiet, unnecessarily spacious. Harry sat across from Cole, legs curled under him, flipping through a book he barely read. Cole worked silently, though his eyes kept flicking upward. He liked having Harry nearby. The soft presence, the warmth, the quiet that wasn't empty. The hotel suite in Geneva was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows, a balcony that overlooked the lake, and only one bedroom. Harry stood in the entryway, unsure. "Do you want me to sleep on the couch?" Cole frowned. "No, the bed's big enough." Harry hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The first night, after a long dinner with potential investors, Cole returned to the room feeling oddly restless. He'd been sharp all evening, perfectly poised, but the moment he stepped into the quiet suite and saw Harry curled on the bed, flipping channels absently, something inside him loosened. Harry looked up. "You're back." Cole shed his jacket, tossed it onto a chair. They were exhausting. Harry smiled faintly. "You looked calm." "I was faking," Harry laughed softly. "You're good at that." Cole sat beside him on the edge of the bed. For a moment, they didn't speak. Just sat there in the dim hotel light, the city glittering below them. Then Cole said, "Why did you take care of me when I was sick?" Harry blinked. "Because I wanted to." "That's not an answer." Harry turned to him. "Because you matter to me. Because even if this isn't real for you, it became real for me." Cole looked at him for a long time, then leaned in. Their lips met, slow, soft, tentative. It wasn't practiced. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't like the kisses Cole had given or taken from countless others. It was real. When they pulled apart, Harry's cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "I've never been kissed like that," he whispered. Cole's throat tightened. "I'm not going to hurt you." Harry smiled, shy and warm. "I know." But Cole looked haunted, like he wasn't sure he deserved that trust. They didn't kiss again that night. They just lay side by side, sharing silence and space. But something had changed. something that couldn't be undone. Back home, Mason Alden seethed. The Harrington account, his family's most lucrative connection, had frozen. Cole wasn't taking calls. Something had shifted, and Mason was beginning to suspect that Harry was no longer playing along. So he acted. He had Harry's laptop password. He'd watched him type it in during a family dinner months ago. He used it to send malware, small, discreet, a backdoor protocol into Cole's data system. Just enough to force a vulnerability, enough to get a foot in the door. What Mason didn't realize was that Cole's tech security had been upgraded since the last breach. The trace was found within hours. And the signature? Unmistakably Harry's. When Cole confronted him, it wasn't like before. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He simply stood in the middle of the suite, holding Harry's laptop in one hand, his other clenched at his side. "What is this?" he asked. Harry stared at the device. What do you mean?" Cole opened the file, showed him the access logs. The path, the trace. Harry's stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. "No, I didn't do this." "You're the only one with this account," Cole said coldly. "The only one with access." Harry's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed. "My brother," he said, voice shaking. He must have used it. He's been pressuring me, my family. They made me do this, the whole thing, from the beginning. The marriage. They wanted me to get close to you, to find your financials. But I swear to you, I never." His voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt you." Cole stared at him. Harry's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared. I didn't want this life, not like this. But they said they'd cut me off, take everything. They raised me like a tool, not a person. And then I met you, and you were cold, but kind in your own way. And I started to care, and I didn't know how to stop." The tears fell freely now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Cole sat down slowly across from him, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, "You should have told me." Harry buried his face in his hands. "I was scared. I would have protected you," Harry sobbed. "I didn't know you'd want to." And there it was, the truth neither of them had wanted to say aloud. Cole exhaled slowly, then stood. Then walked to the desk, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "This is Cole Harrington. Terminate all contracts with the Alden family. Effective immediately. Pull the funds. Freeze the accounts. Blacklist them from future partnership consideration. Yes. All of them." He hung up, turned to Harry. "You're not a pawn anymore," he said quietly. "You're mine." Harry looked up, stunned. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." And then he crossed the room, pulled Harry up from the bed, kissed him. Deep this time, with heat and promise and something close to desperation. They undressed slowly, reverently, as if every layer was a wound being exposed. In the soft light of the hotel room, Cole laid Harry down against the pillows and touched him like he was made of porcelain and starlight. There was no rush, no hunger to devour, just lips pressed to skin, fingers laced, breath shared, whispers exchanged. "I want to make this real. I've never done this before. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe." And for the first time in his life, Harry believed it. When they moved together, it wasn't just bodies. It was something holy. Something broken being carefully, painfully made whole again. After, Cole wrapped Harry in his arms and kissed the top of his head, holding him like something precious, like something he never planned to let go. And Harry, curled against his chest, whispered, "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere before this." Cole kissed his temple. "You do now." Chapter 6. I Didn't Know Love Until You. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. They were better. Gone was the cold, calculated silence of the Harrington mansion. In its place, warmth had bloomed in quiet, beautiful ways. Mornings with shared coffee, nights curled beneath blankets, laughter echoing in rooms that used to be silent. Cole had stopped closing himself off. Harry had stopped holding his breath. They cooked together now. At first it was awkward. Cole burning toast, Harry oversalting pasta. But there was laughter, the kind that softened tension and filled the house with something unspoken but undeniable. Sometimes Monica would wander through the kitchen, tear up, and claim it was just the onions. Harry now slept in Cole's bed every night. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. It was never about sex or obligation. It was about falling asleep to the rhythm of someone else's breathing. About curling into warmth that welcomed you. About waking up to a hand gently stroking your hair and a voice murmuring, "Stay a little longer." and Cole had changed. Not in the ways the world could see. He was still sharp, still respected, still terrifying in the boardroom. But at home, in the privacy of the life they built, he was softer, slower. He smiled more. He touched Harry with reverence, with quiet adoration. He never stopped whispering his name, while brushing a curl from his forehead, while kissing his shoulder in the early morning, while pulling him into an embrace like he was afraid Harry might vanish in his sleep. Harry, for the first time in his life, believed he was wanted. He was seen. It was a rainy afternoon when Harry sat cross-legged in the study, surrounded by papers and mechanical sketches. His hair was in soft disarray, sleeves pushed up, graphite smudged on his fingertips. Cole stood in the doorway, watching him. Harry didn't notice at first, too absorbed in the design he was refining, adjusting angles, scribbling equations with quiet intensity. Finally, Cole cleared his throat. Harry looked up, startled, and immediately tried to gather his things. "Sorry, I didn't mean to take over the whole room." "Stop," Cole said, smiling. "Don't move." Harry blinked. "What? You look." Cole shook his head, amused. "Like you belong here." Harry's lips parted, heart skipping once. "I do?" Cole stepped into the room. "What are you working on?" "It's nothing really," Harry said quickly. "Just a concept for a microreactor for renewable thermal regulation in building systems. Something your energy subsidiary mentioned needing in that investor meeting last month." Cole raised a brow. "You were listening to that?" Harry gave a small, shy nod. "I always listen." Cole picked up the blueprints, examined them. After a long, thoughtful pause, he looked back at Harry. "This is brilliant." Harry flushed. "It's just an idea. It's going to be more than an idea." Cole dropped the papers gently on the desk. "I want this developed, funded. I want you to lead it." Harry froze. "You don't have to do that just because—" "I'm not doing it because I love you," Cole interrupted, voice firm but warm. "I'm doing it because you're a genius. The rest is just a bonus." And that was how it began. Harry, the soft-spoken engineering student no one ever looked twice at, became a silent force in Cole's empire. He didn't attend press conferences, didn't speak at galas, but Cole credited him by name, publicly. And every time his name appeared in a press release or a shareholder memo, Harry would run his fingers over the words and whisper, "He sees me." One evening, Harry stood on the balcony, wrapped in one of Cole's sweaters, staring out at the glittering skyline. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of rain and spring. Cole came up behind him, arms wrapping loosely around his waist. Harry leaned back against his chest. "You've been quiet tonight," Cole said. "Just thinking," Harry murmured. "About?" Harry turned in his arms. "About how no one ever looked at me the way you do." Cole brushed a curl from his face. "How do I look at you?" Harry hesitated, eyes glassy. "Like I matter." Cole exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket. Harry's breath caught when Cole pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a delicate silver ring, simple and elegant, with a band that shimmered subtly in the light. "It's not the one I married you with," Cole said, voice low. "That one was for obligation. This one's for love." Harry covered his mouth with his hand, eyes filling. "I want you to choose me this time," Cole added. "Not because you have to. Because you want to." Harry didn't speak. He just threw his arms around Cole and whispered, "Yes, yes, I do." The vow renewal was small, just a few close friends, business partners, and Monica, who sobbed through the entire ceremony and loudly insisted it was allergies. Cole wore a sleek black suit. Harry wore cream again like on the first day, but this time his cheeks were flushed with happiness, not fear. They stood under soft lights in the Harrington garden, holding hands. Cole whispered, "You saved my life." Harry whispered back, "You gave me one." They kissed to the sound of gentle applause, the world finally right. Cole's company continued to thrive. Investors were happy. Partnerships flourished. The world saw Cole Harrington as more powerful than ever. But behind the scenes, he never stopped coming home to Harry. He never stopped making dinner, or drawing him close at night, or whispering his name like a prayer into his ear until Harry fell asleep with a smile on his face. And every night, Harry would close his eyes and listen to that voice, low and gentle. "Harry, I love you. You're safe with me. You're mine." He never had to be alone again. He never had to hide again. And in the quiet of their bedroom, heart full and body warm, Harry whispered the truth that had changed everything. They forced me to marry him to steal his fortune, but what I stole instead was his heart. Chapter 1. The Betrayal That Shattered Me. Jared stepped out of the cab, exhaling a slow breath as he stared up at the apartment building glowing with warm lights. Laughter and music spilled into the cold night air, a reminder of the celebration happening inside. His boyfriend, Ethan, had insisted on throwing this party, a casual gathering of friends, drinks, and expensive champagne to toast some new work success Jared hadn't fully understood. It should have been a normal night. He adjusted the cuff of his dark sweater, ignoring the anxious flutter in his chest. Things between him and Ethan had been off lately. Distant. Jared had blamed it on stress, long hours, and the occasional sharp remark that had started to slip between them. Still, they had been together for 3 years. Relationships weren't always perfect. As he stepped inside, weaving through clusters of well-dressed guests, Jared felt his stomach twist. He didn't see Ethan immediately, but that wasn't unusual. He was always the center of attention at events like this, effortlessly charming, always knowing the right thing to say. Jared smiled at a few familiar faces, but didn't stop to chat. He wanted to find Ethan. Just a quick hello, a kiss, some reassurance that whatever tension had crept between them was just his own overthinking. Then he saw him. Ethan stood near the balcony doors, the city skyline a blur behind him. His arm was wrapped around someone taller, blonde, undeniably attractive. They were laughing, their bodies close, pressed against each other as if sharing a secret. Jared felt his chest tighten, but he told himself it was nothing. Just a friend. A joke. Ethan was affectionate with people. He always had been. But then, as if the universe to crush the last bit of hope inside him, Ethan leaned in and kissed the man. It wasn't a drunken, meaningless kiss. It wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was deep, lingering, full of intent. Ethan's hand slid into the man's hair, fingers curling with familiarity. The sound around Jared disappeared. His heart pounded against his ribs, a dull, painful rhythm that drowned out the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses. His breath caught in his throat, his body refusing to move, as if freezing in place would somehow make it untrue. But it wasn't untrue. It was happening. Ethan was kissing someone else, and Jared was standing there, watching the man he loved betray him like it was the easiest thing in the world. Someone brushed past him, jostling his shoulder, but he barely noticed. It took a full 10 seconds before his body remembered how to function again, and when it did, it moved without his permission. He was walking forward. Ethan. His voice was quiet, hoarse, barely audible over the music. Ethan broke the kiss, blinking lazily before turning his head. His expression barely changed. No shock, no guilt, just mild annoyance at the interruption. Jared's stomach twisted into a painful knot. "Jared," Ethan said, tone flat, like Jared was an afterthought, an inconvenience. He straightened but didn't step away from the man he'd just been kissing. Jared's pulse roared in his ears. He couldn't look at the stranger, couldn't even process who he was, because all he could see was Ethan, the man who was supposed to love him, standing there with that infuriatingly indifferent look on his face. "What?" Jared swallowed, trying to force his voice to be steady. "What the hell is this?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead as if this whole thing was exhausting for him. "Jared, don't make a scene." "A scene?" The words barely scraped out of his throat. "Are you serious?" Ethan exhaled sharply and finally stepped away from the blonde, but not in the way Jared wanted. Not in a way that said this was a mistake. Instead, he crossed his arms, looking at Jared like he was bored. "You didn't really think this was forever, did you?" Ethan asked, his lips curling with something almost amused. Jared felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The ground beneath him felt like it was splitting apart. Ethan's gaze flickered past him, scanning the room, completely unfazed. Like he didn't care. Like none of it ever mattered. "I found someone I actually want," Ethan continued, shrugging. There it was, the final blow. Jared was dimly aware that people were staring. Whispers hummed in the background, but all he could focus on was the way Ethan looked at him, like he was disposable, like 3 years together had meant nothing. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms so hard it hurt. He needed to say something. Anything. But what was there left to say? He was already drowning. Ethan didn't wait for a response. With one last glance, he turned away. Just like that. Just left. And Jared. Jared was standing there, alone. Someone touched his shoulder. He flinched, barely turning before he saw Ron standing beside him, brows furrowed, concern evident in his warm brown eyes. "Jared," Ron said, voice softer than usual. Jared didn't know how long he'd been there, if he'd seen everything, if he'd just arrived. But something in Ron's face made it clear. He knew. Jared couldn't do this. He needed to get out. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the party, his steps heavy, numbness creeping into his limbs. He didn't see the way Ron immediately followed, weaving through the crowd like he had one priority in the entire world. Outside, the cold air hit Jared like a slap to the face, but it wasn't enough to clear the storm inside him. He felt sick. His chest ached in a way he had never known was possible. He wanted to scream, to break something, to disappear entirely. His breaths came out shaky, uneven, his whole body trembling. Behind him, the door swung open again. Jared didn't need to turn to know who it was. Ron's voice was gentle but unwavering. "I'm taking you home." Jared almost told him to leave. Almost insisted that he was fine. But he wasn't fine. And Ron was still standing there, unwavering, refusing to let him go through this alone. Jared's throat tightened. His body sagged just slightly. And without another word, Ron led him away from the party, away from the wreckage of his broken heart. Chapter 2. Spiraling into the darkness. Jared had always thought heartbreak would be loud, screaming, crying, fists slamming into walls. Instead, it was silent. It was the heavy, crushing emptiness that settled in his chest and refused to leave. Days blurred into each other. The apartment, once shared with Ethan, now felt like a mausoleum. He barely left his bed. The sheets tangled around him, trapping him in a cocoon of exhaustion. He didn't have the energy to untangle them. Didn't have the energy for anything. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. Jared rolled over and squeezed his eyes shut. If he stayed still enough, maybe his thoughts would stop racing. Maybe he wouldn't think about Ethan's hands in someone else's hair, Ethan's lips on someone else's mouth, Ethan's words, "I found someone I actually want." He wanted to disappear. The texts kept coming. Ron. Jared knew without looking. Ron had been relentless, forcing himself into Jared's orbit ever since the party. He had driven Jared home that night, walked him to the door, and even though Jared had slammed it in his face, Ron had just laughed and said, "I'll see you tomorrow." Jared had thought he was joking. He wasn't. Every single day since, Ron had been there, knocking, texting, calling. Jared ignored all of it. Until one evening, there was no knock, no text. For the first time in over a week, Ron didn't show up. Jared told himself he didn't care. He told himself it didn't matter. Then, at 9 p.m., his door burst open. Jared barely had time to lift his head before Ron strode in, carrying 2 large takeout bags and whistling like he hadn't just broken into someone's home. "What the?" Jared's voice cracked from disuse. "How did you?" Ron dangled a spare key between his fingers, grinning. "You gave me this 6 months ago when you thought you'd get locked out while drunk. Remember?" Jared did remember, and right now, he regretted it. "You weren't supposed to keep it." Ron ignored him, dropping the bags on the coffee table. The scent of warm food filled the apartment. Jared's stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with nausea. He hadn't eaten properly in days. His body had stopped asking for it. Ron plopped down onto the couch, kicking his feet up like he owned the place. "All right, Jared. It's time for your regularly scheduled Ron annoys you until you remember your human session." Jared groaned and pulled the blanket over his head. "Go away." "Can't." Ron's voice was infuriatingly cheerful. "I took a personal oath to ruin your miserable little depression cave." Jared peeked out from the blanket. "I don't need your pity, Ron." Ron didn't even flinch. He just smirked. "Good, because I don't pity you. I just think it's tragic that I have to be the one to remind you that you're actually a great guy." Jared clenched his jaw. "I don't feel like a great guy." "Yeah, well, feelings are dumb." Ron dug into the takeout bag and pulled out a box of fries. "You think I felt like coming here to babysit you?" "No, but I did it anyway, because I know you, Jared, and I know that if I leave you alone, you're just gonna rot in here." Jared turned away, staring at the wall. He hated how well Ron knew him. There was a long silence. Ron didn't push. He just sat there, munching on fries like it was the most normal thing in the world. Then, finally, Jared muttered, I wasted 3 years of my life on someone who never even loved me. Ron didn't laugh. He didn't tease. When he spoke, his voice was softer. No, you spent 3 years loving someone who didn't deserve you. That's different. Jared swallowed. He didn't have a response to that. Ron reached for another fry. Eat something. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Jared sighed, but for some reason picked up a foot in his mouth and chewed. It tasted like nothing. Ron grinned. See? Progress. Jared rolled his eyes, but it was the first time in days he felt something other than numbness. The texts kept coming. Jared didn't reply to them, but Ron sent them anyway. Ron. Yo, I saw a guy at the grocery store today who looked like a discount Ethan. I considered punching him on your behalf, but I figured that would be frowned upon. Do not ignore this message. If you do, I'll assume you've been kidnapped by aliens and I'll have no choice but to storm Area 51 to get you back. Hey, it's okay to be sad. Just don't stay there forever, okay? Jared stared at that last message for a long time, and for the first time, he typed back. I don't know how to stop feeling like this. Ron's response was instant. You don't. Not right away. But you let people help. And lucky for you, I'm annoying enough to stick around until you do. Jared let out a breath. And somehow, for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. Chapter 3. The Arranged Marriage Offer. Jared had expected his parents to check in on him. Maybe a phone call or an awkwardly worded text asking if he was okay after the breakup. What he hadn't expected was to be summoned to dinner under the vague but urgent excuse of something important. So now he sat at his parents' dining table, arms crossed, staring at them in mild disbelief as they laid out their so-called solution to his crumbling life. An arranged marriage. With Ron. Jared blinked at them. Then, against all odds, he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You're kidding. His mother, seated across from him, did not laugh. His father's expression remained unreadable. You think I need a husband when I can barely function as a person? Jared gestured vaguely at himself, at the mess that he was. His eyes were hollow, his hair unkempt, and the dark circles under his eyes were proof that he hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. He was a walking disaster, barely holding himself together with duct tape and sheer spite. His mother sighed, setting her utensils down with a quiet clink. We're worried about you, Jared. You won't talk to anyone. You barely leave your apartment. I'm fine, Jared muttered, though the words carried no conviction. No, you're not, his father cut in. And we're not going to sit by and watch you waste away. Jared gritted his teeth. So your solution is to marry me off like I'm a broken appliance that needs replacing? His mother ignored the sarcasm. Ron has always cared about you, and he's willing to help. Jared exhaled sharply. Ron doesn't even like me like that. Are you sure? His father asked, raising an eyebrow. Jared hesitated. That wasn't entirely true, was it? Ron had always been there. Too much, too persistent, too unshakable in his determination to pull Jared back from whatever abyss he was sinking into. Before he could respond, the dining room door opened, and Ron himself walked in. Jared stiffened, whipping his head toward him. You knew about this? Ron, ever the image of unbothered confidence, smirked as he slid into the chair beside Jared. Yup. Jared stared at him, waiting for further explanation, but Ron just reached for a dinner roll like he was completely comfortable with this insanity. You're actually considering this? Jared asked, incredulous. Ron shrugged. It's not the worst idea. Jared let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You cannot be serious. Ron finally looked at him. Really looked at him. There was no teasing in his expression now, no light-hearted jokes. Just quiet, steady sincerity. You don't have to love me, Ron said softly. Just let me stay. Let me help. Jared opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Because Ron wasn't saying this as a joke or as some half-hearted attempt to fix him. He was offering himself. Offering his time, his presence, his patience. A lump formed in Jared's throat. Ron had already been doing this for weeks, checking in, forcing him to eat, dragging him outside when he would have rather rotted in bed. If Jared accepted this insane offer, nothing would change. Ron would just keep doing what he was already doing. But this time it wouldn't just be friendship, it would be something else. Jared hesitated. Then, out of sheer exhaustion, out of sheer hopelessness, he let out a slow breath. Fine. His parents looked relieved. Ron simply smiled. And just like that, Jared found himself engaged to the only person who refused to let him drown. Jared tried not to think about the absurdity of his situation. He tried not to think about how, days ago, he had been convinced he was unlovable, that his heart had been shattered beyond repair, that Ethan had ruined him. But Ron had stepped into the wreckage and stayed. Ron, who showed up uninvited. Ron, who refused to let Jared sink into despair. Ron, who was always there, even when Jared didn't want him to be. Jared still didn't understand why Ron was doing this, why he had agreed to a trial engagement with someone as emotionally wrecked as Jared. But Ron was relentless. He forced Jared to eat, to take care of himself. He pulled him outside for walks, even when Jared snapped at him. He dragged Jared to the grocery store, the park, anywhere that wasn't the confines of his own loneliness. One evening, after an exhausting day of existing, Jared collapsed onto the couch, rubbing his temples. Ron, sprawled out beside him, threw an arm over the back of the couch and grinned. "You know, for a guy who hates me, you sure let me manhandle you into functioning a lot." Jared exhaled a tired laugh. "I don't hate you." Ron nudged his knee playfully. "Aw, that's the nicest thing you've said to me all week." Jared rolled his eyes but didn't move away. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind Ron being here. Ethan returns. Jared hadn't seen or spoken to Ethan since the party. He hadn't wanted to, so when he ran into him at a cafe, the encounter felt like a slap to the face. Ethan, looking as polished as ever, barely glanced at him before smirking. "So, I heard you're engaged." Jared's spine stiffened. "None of your business." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Wow, from sobbing in your apartment to a conveniently timed engagement? That's desperate, even for you." Jared clenched his jaw. The words cut deep, but before he could respond, Ron stepped in. He slid an arm around Jared's shoulders with an easy, confident smirk. "Oh, it's real, all right. I'd show you our sex tape for proof, but I doubt you could handle it." Ethan's expression soured. "You're pathetic." Ron's smile didn't falter. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you." Jared expected Ethan to have some cutting remark, but instead, he just scoffed and walked away. When he was gone, Ron turned to Jared. "You okay?" Jared stared at him, feeling something shift in his chest, something lighter. He had expected Ron to fight Ethan for him. What he hadn't expected was how effortlessly Ron had defended him, like it wasn't even a question. Jared swallowed. "Yeah, I think I am." Ron smiled, and for the first time Jared let himself believe, just a little, that maybe this arranged marriage wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Chapter 4. The Spark of Something New. Jared had never realized how quiet his apartment was until Ron moved in. The silence that had once been comforting in its emptiness, his own personal void, was now constantly interrupted. Ron hummed when he cooked, sang loudly and off-key in the shower, and had an infuriating habit of narrating his actions like he was starring in a sitcom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ron declared one morning, flipping an omelet in the pan with an exaggerated wrist flick. "Today, we witness an extraordinary culinary event. Chef Ron, defying all odds, successfully prepares a breakfast without burning down Jared's kitchen." Jared, groggy from sleep, rubbed his eyes and scowled from where he sat at the dining table. "It's 7 a.m., and you're already unbearable." Ron winked. "Babe, I was born unbearable." Jared threw a piece of toast at him. Ron yelped, dramatically clutching his heart. "Betrayal. I slave away in the kitchen, and this is the thanks I get?" Despite himself, Jared felt his lips twitch. It was like this every day now. The apartment, which had once been suffocating with its loneliness, had transformed into something else, something alive. Ron made it impossible to wallow. He dragged Jared out of bed when he tried to sleep through the day. He forced him to eat, to talk, to exist. At first, Jared had been irritated by it, but then, little by little, it became routine. He found himself anticipating Ron's obnoxious morning performances. He got used to hearing music in the background, to Ron filling the space with his constant chatter. He no longer felt the crushing weight of silence pressing down on him when he walked through the door. And, perhaps most surprising of all, he started smiling again. Not often, not fully, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he caught himself laughing at one of Ron's ridiculous stories, or rolling his eyes fondly instead of with exasperation. Something inside him, something broken, was slowly being pieced back together. One evening, Jared found himself sitting on the couch, nursing a cup of tea while Ron flipped through a random book he'd picked off the shelf. It had been a quiet day. A comfortable kind of quiet, not the painful, empty kind. Ron, lounging lazily on the other end of the couch, suddenly broke the silence. "You know," he said, his voice unusually thoughtful, "I've had a thing for you for years." Jared, mid-sip, choked on his tea. Ron barely spared him a glance. "Yeah, should have warned you before dropping that, huh?" Jared coughed, setting his mug down before looking at him with wide, stunned eyes. "What?" Ron smirked, but it wasn't his usual playful grin. It was smaller, softer. "Don't look so shocked. I figured it was pretty obvious." Jared blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. Ron had liked him? For years? He stared, trying to read Ron's expression, but the man was infuriatingly hard to pin down, relaxed as always, but there was something raw underneath. Jared's mouth felt dry. "But you never said anything." Ron shrugged. "You were with Ethan. You were in love." Jared's stomach twisted. He thought back to all the times Ron had been there, on the sidelines, watching but never interfering. How had he never noticed? "Why didn't you?" Jared stopped himself. He wasn't sure what he was asking. "Why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me waste my time on someone who never really loved me?" Ron chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Jared, I'm a lot of things, but I'm not an asshole. You were happy, or at least, I thought you were. I wasn't gonna mess with that." Jared swallowed, something shifting inside him. He had always assumed Ron was just Ron, loud, ridiculous, impossible to take seriously. But now, looking at him, really looking at him, he realized there was so much more beneath the surface. And suddenly he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Chapter 5. A Different Kind of Love. The last thing Jared expected when he woke up that morning was for Ron to throw a bag at him and announce, "Pack your things. We're going on a road trip." Jared had blinked at him, still groggy from sleep. "What?" Ron had grinned, unbothered by Jared's confusion. "Road. Trip. You know, the thing where you get in a car, drive somewhere random, and rediscover your will to live." Jared frowned. "I don't." Ron clapped his hands together. "Nope. No arguments. Your trial fiancé is kidnapping you for the weekend. It's already decided." Jared had rolled his eyes, but despite himself, something inside him stirred. A quiet warmth, a whisper of something light and new. So he packed his bag, and they left, breathing again. They drove for hours with no real destination. Ron insisted on taking the scenic routes. Coastal roads where the sky stretched endlessly, and forests that felt like something out of a dream. At first, Jared just watched from the passenger seat, his heart strangely at ease as Ron filled the silence with stories, exaggerated impressions of their mutual friends, and an obnoxiously loud playlist that he refused to turn down. But then, somewhere between the winding roads and the blur of the outside world, Jared started to laugh. It wasn't forced. It wasn't hollow. It was real. Ron caught it immediately. "Oh my God, ladies and gentlemen, it finally happened!" He threw his hands up dramatically, swerving slightly before correcting the wheel. "Jared Hart has laughed. What a historical moment." Jared shoved his shoulder, still chuckling. "Watch the road, idiot," Ron grinned. "Gladly, now that my mission is complete." Jared rolled his eyes, but something inside him felt lighter. Maybe Ron was right. Maybe life wasn't just about pain and heartbreak. Maybe it was still beautiful. Dancing in the rain. That night, they stopped in a quiet little town, staying in a roadside motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. It was raining when they stepped outside, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the empty road. Jared pulled his hoodie tighter around him, shivering slightly. "We should head back inside." Ron smirked. "Nah." Jared raised an eyebrow. "Nah?" Ron suddenly grabbed his hand and yanked him forward. Jared stumbled, caught off guard. "What the hell are you?" But then Ron started dancing. Right there, in the middle of the wet pavement, with no music, just the rain and the sound of their laughter. Jared's heart skipped. "You're insane," he muttered, but he didn't pull away. Ron grinned. "You need to loosen up. When was the last time you did something just for fun?" Jared hesitated. "Too long. He exhaled, and then just for a moment he let go. They spun around in the rain, their hands linked, their clothes soaked. Ron dipped him dramatically at one point, causing Jared to yelp before dissolving into laughter. It felt ridiculous. It felt free. And as Ron pulled him close again, his grin softer now, Jared felt something shift. For the first time he wondered, could he love Ron? Ethan's jealousy. When they returned home, Jared barely had time to unpack before there was a knock at his door. He opened it without thinking, and there stood Ethan. Jared's stomach twisted, but not with longing, not with pain, just irritation. Ethan's expression was a mix of anger and something possessive. "So it's true?" he scoffed. "You're actually engaged to Ron?" Jared sighed. "What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan crossed his arms. "I want to understand how you went from sobbing over me to shacking up with someone else in a matter of weeks." Jared stiffened. "You don't get to judge me." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "It's pathetic, Jared. You're just settling because you can't handle being alone." A few weeks ago, those words would have destroyed him. But now, Jared just felt tired. For the first time, he didn't break. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and met Ethan's gaze with unshaken confidence. "I'm done," he said simply. Ethan frowned. "What?" "I'm done being your backup plan. Done being the guy you discard and then expect to still be waiting for you." Jared exhaled slowly, feeling the last of his old self finally slip away. "You made your choice, Ethan, and now I'm making mine." Ethan scoffed, but Jared could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or the realization that he had lost something he could never get back. Jared didn't wait for another word. He shut the door in Ethan's face. When he turned around, Ron was there. Leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed, eyes filled with something unreadable. Jared swallowed. "You heard all that?" Ron shrugged. "Enough of it." Jared hesitated. He had been so certain of himself a minute ago, but now, with Ron standing there, looking at him like that, he felt exposed. But Ron didn't tease him. He didn't gloat. He just stepped forward, and then without hesitation, Jared kissed him. It wasn't desperate or rushed. It was tentative, soft, real. And for the first time in forever, Jared wasn't thinking about Ethan. He was thinking about Ron. Just Ron. Chapter 6. Choosing Happiness. Jared had always believed that love was supposed to be grand, dramatic, and all-consuming, that it was something fought for, something that came with fireworks and impossible odds. But real love? It was Ron. It was waking up to his ridiculous singing, to his bad jokes and exaggerated impressions of strangers they passed on the street. It was never feeling like he had to prove his worth, never questioning if he was enough. Because to Ron, he always had been. Jared sat on the couch, watching as Ron dramatically flipped through a wedding planning book, muttering about how expensive flowers were. "You're seriously worried about flowers?" Jared teased, leaning back against the cushions. Ron sighed, flipping the book shut and tossing it onto the table. "Listen, I just think it's a scam. Like, why do we need 50 white roses? Are we summoning a Victorian ghost?" Jared chuckled, shaking his head. Ron turned to him then, a lazy smirk curling at his lips. "So does this mean I win the Jared Love lottery?" Jared rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. "Yeah, you idiot," he said, nudging Ron's knee with his own. "You win." A wedding full of love. Their wedding wasn't extravagant. It wasn't a grand ballroom affair or some dramatic elopement in another country. It was small, intimate, warm. A handful of close friends, Jared's parents, Ron's sister, who made an inappropriate toast about how she always knew her brother was whipped. The venue was nothing fancy, just a small outdoor ceremony under a canopy of lights, the air filled with the scent of late spring flowers. But it was perfect. Jared stood across from Ron, his hands slightly shaky, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming certainty that he had made the right choice. Ron, ever the same, beamed at him, like Jared had just given him the best gift in the world. When the vows were exchanged, Jared felt his throat tighten. Ron's words weren't flowery or rehearsed. They were simple. Honest. "I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you trip over your own feet at a coffee shop. You thought no one noticed, but I did. And somehow every day since then, I've found more reasons to love you." Didn't cry. Okay, maybe a little. And then Ron kissed him in front of everyone in front of the world, like he was something precious, like he had always been meant to be Ron's. The night they chose each other. That night, when it was just the two of them, Jared wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared of the future. He wasn't haunted by the past. He was just here. Ron kissed him slowly. Not desperate, not rushed, just them, learning each other in ways they hadn't before. Jared had spent so long believing he was unworthy of love, but Ron had never let him believe that. Now, in the quiet of their room, with their hands tangled together, Jared let himself believe, because Ethan had left him broken, but Ron had loved him whole. And for the first time in years, Jared wasn't afraid to be happy. Epilogue, a love that stayed. The morning light filtered through the bedroom window, casting a soft glow over the sheets. Jared stirred, blinking sleepily as warmth curled around his waist. Ron's arm was draped over him, his grip loose but instinctive, like even in sleep he refused to let Jared go. Jared turned slightly, watching him. Ron's hair was a mess, sticking up in all directions, his lips slightly parted, his breathing steady. He looked ridiculous, and Jared loved him. The realization wasn't sudden, it hadn't been for a long time. Love with Ron wasn't a lightning strike or a chaotic storm. It was steady, warm, always there. Jared reached out, brushing his fingers against Ron's cheek. Ron grumbled, but didn't wake. Instead, he shifted closer, burying his face in Jared's neck with a sigh. Jared chuckled softly. "You're such a clingy sleeper." Ron, half asleep, muttered, "You love it." Jared didn't argue. Happiness after everything. Their life together wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. There were still moments when Jared hesitated, when the past tried to creep in, whispering old insecurities. But Ron always saw him. He never let Jared fall too deep into his thoughts. He made every day lighter. Mornings were filled with dumb arguments over coffee. Afternoons were spent going on impulsive adventures because Ron never liked sitting still. Evenings were spent tangled together on the couch, Ron talking too much, Jared pretending to be annoyed but secretly loving every second. Jared had once thought he'd never be whole again, but Ron had never let him believe that for long. Now, as Jared lay in bed, with Ron's warmth beside him and the world still quiet, he let out a slow breath. He didn't regret a thing. Ethan had broken him, but Ron had been there to love him back to life. And now? Now, he was finally truly happy. Chapter 1: The Coldest Groom. Andrew Monroe had always imagined his wedding day would be something out of a dream. Maybe not a fairy tale, but at least something meaningful. Something with warmth. Laughter. Love. Instead, he stood in the grand Lancaster Estates ballroom, surrounded by dazzling chandeliers, 100 guests dressed in expensive designer wear, and the sharp, suffocating scent of champagne and power. And yet, the coldest thing in the room was his groom. Parker Lancaster stood beside him at the altar, unreadable as ever, his sharp jawline set in a firm line. His icy blue eyes, ones that had captivated the attention of every investor and high-profile executive in the city, barely spared Andrew a glance. He was impeccably dressed, his black suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair styled without a single strand out of place. Andrew, on the other hand, felt like a fool. He was no stranger to looking good. His auburn hair was styled just right, his hazel eyes lined slightly darker with a touch of nerves, and the suit he wore was arguably just as expensive as Parker's. But none of it mattered. Not when he felt invisible next to the man who was supposed to be his husband. When the officiant finally spoke the words, "You may now kiss the groom," Parker hesitated for half a second before leaning in. Not to kiss him. Not to even whisper anything in his ear. Just a simple, barely there peck at the corner of his mouth. Andrew barely felt it before Parker was already pulling away, as if fulfilling a contract. The crowd clapped, but Andrew felt the sting of humiliation settle in his chest like a weight. He could hear the whispers already. They're a business merger, not a real couple. He's just an accessory. Parker doesn't even like him. Maybe they were right. Marriage in name only. The ride to their new home, Parker's penthouse, of course, was filled with silence. Andrew sat stiffly in the back of the luxury car, his hands clasped in his lap. He wanted to say something to break the unbearable tension, but Parker was scrolling through his phone, perfectly at ease. as if today had been nothing but a slight inconvenience in his schedule. "So," Andrew finally said, trying not to sound as exhausted as he felt. "I guess this is real now." Parker barely looked up. "It was real the moment we signed the papers." Andrew let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Right. How could I forget?" Parker didn't respond. Andrew turned to look out the window instead. The city lights blurred past them, cold and distant, like the man sitting beside him. He had expected an arranged marriage to be awkward, maybe even difficult. But he hadn't expected it to feel like he was marrying a ghost. When they finally arrived at Parker's penthouse, Andrew stepped inside and took it all in. It was everything he had imagined. Sleek, modern, minimalistic. It screamed wealth, prestige, and absolutely zero warmth. Parker walked past him, already undoing his tie. "Your things were moved in earlier. Your room is down the hall." Andrew turned confused. "My room?" Parker glanced at him. "Did you think we'd be sharing?" Andrew blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I don't know. I guess I just thought." He let out a soft sigh, shaking his head. "Never mind." Parker didn't say anything else before disappearing into what was clearly his master bedroom. Andrew stood in the hallway for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. He had expected distance, but he hadn't expected this. Loneliness and silence. Days passed, then weeks. The pattern remained the same. Parker would leave early for work, barely saying a word. Andrew would spend most of his time in the penthouse alone, left to his own devices. The staff were polite, but distant, treating him with the same professionalism they treated Parker. No one ever asked how he was adjusting. No one even acknowledged the obvious tension between the newlyweds. At first, Andrew tried. He made breakfast once, sat across from Parker at the dining table. Parker barely glanced up from his tablet before muttering, "I don't eat breakfast." Andrew clenched his jaw. "Well, you do now." Parker raised a single brow, unimpressed. "No, I don't." Andrew nearly slammed the plate down. "Fine, starve." That had been one of the few times Parker had actually looked at him with something other than indifference. Still, it hadn't lasted. A faint crack in the armor. One evening, after another long, lonely day in the penthouse, Andrew decided he needed a break. Instead of sulking in a house that didn't feel like home, he went out. He found a cozy art cafe downtown, the kind of place he would have spent hours in before this mess of a marriage. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like himself. He drank coffee, worked on some sketches, even chatted with the barista, Leo, a sweet guy with a dimpled grin who clearly flirted with him. And when he returned home, feeling lighter than he had in days, he found Parker standing in the living room, waiting. Andrew frowned. "You're home early." Parker's gaze flickered to the clock. "It's nearly midnight." Andrew shrugged, kicking off his shoes. "Yeah, well, I had things to do." Parker studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. "Where were you?" Andrew raised a brow. "Are you actually asking, or are you just making conversation for the first time in weeks?" Parker exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm asking because you didn't mention going anywhere." Andrew crossed his arms. "Do I need permission now?" Parker's jaw tensed. "That's not what I said." Andrew scoffed. "Then what are you saying, Parker?" A muscle in Parker's jaw twitched, but he said nothing, just turned away. And for some reason, that pissed Andrew off more than anything. "God, you never talk," Andrew snapped, stepping forward. "You treat this marriage like a damn business deal, like I'm just some contract you signed. Do you even care that I exist, or am I just an inconvenience to you?" Parker finally met his gaze, and for once there was something there, a flicker of something unreadable, something raw. Then, just like that, it was gone. Without another word, Parker turned and walked away, retreating into his room like he always did. Andrew stood there, heart hammering. For the first time since this marriage began, he knew. Parker Lancaster wasn't just cold. He was hiding something. And Andrew? He was done waiting to find out what. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Ice. Andrew Monroe wasn't a fool. If Parker Lancaster thought he could ignore him into silence, he had another thing coming. For the past month, Andrew had played the part of the patient spouse, enduring the silent breakfasts, the cold glances, and the suffocating weight of a marriage that felt more like a business contract than a partnership. But last night, something had changed. Parker had actually reacted. It was subtle, barely a flicker of emotion, but Andrew had caught it. That brief, unguarded moment when Parker met his gaze and his mask cracked, just for a second. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to convince Andrew of one thing. Parker wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. And that was all the motivation Andrew needed. The first clash. The following evening, Parker took him to a business dinner. Not because he wanted to, of course. It was a calculated move, a necessary display for the press, a way to prove that the Lancaster-Monroe merger wasn't just a transaction, but a harmonious union. Andrew didn't even get a proper invitation. He only found out when Parker dropped a neatly pressed suit onto the bed that morning and said, "Be ready by 7." By the time they arrived at the high-end restaurant, Andrew was simmering with frustration. And things only got worse from there. Parker barely acknowledged him throughout the evening. He spent the entire time in stiff conversation with other executives, discussing profits, stocks, and deals that Andrew couldn't care less about. And as if that weren't bad enough, Parker never introduced him. Not once. Andrew was treated like an afterthought, like a ghost, while Parker played the role of the powerful CEO, all smooth efficiency and calculated charm. It was humiliating. By the time dessert arrived, Andrew had reached his breaking point. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his seat. "I need some air." Parker barely looked up. "Don't take too long." Andrew clenched his fists. That was it. That was all Parker had to say? Andrew turned on his heel and stormed toward the terrace, his heart pounding with frustration. The night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. He gripped the marble railing, staring out at the glittering city skyline. Why had he even tried? Why had he hoped, even for a second, that Parker would start seeing him as something more? Leaving so soon? The voice was smooth, amused. Andrew turned to see a man standing beside him, tall, blond, and annoyingly attractive, with a smirk that suggested he had seen the entire disaster unfold. "Not exactly," Andrew muttered. "Just needed a break." The man chuckled, leaning against the railing. "I don't blame you. Parker Lancaster isn't exactly known for his charming personality." Andrew shot him a sharp look. "You know Parker?" "Know him? I've worked with him." The man extended a hand. "Theo Sinclair, business consultant." Andrew hesitated before shaking it. "Nice to meet you, Andrew," Theo said, tilting his head. "You looked miserable in there." Andrew let out a dry laugh. "That obvious?" Theo smirked. "I'd say Parker deserves a kick for the way he's treating you, but I have a feeling you'll do that yourself." Andrew exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't even know if he cares enough to notice." "Oh, he notices," Theo said, eyes glinting. "Trust me." Before Andrew could ask what he meant, the terrace door opened. Parker stepped out, his expression unreadable. Andrew braced himself for some cool, disinterested remark. Instead, Parker's gaze flickered to Theo, his jaw tightening slightly. "Sinclair," Parker said. "Didn't expect to see you here." Theo smirked. "Neither did I, but I'm glad I did." His eyes twinkled with amusement. "Your husband is great company." Parker's gaze flickered to Andrew, then back to Theo. Something unreadable passed across his face. "Andrew," Parker said, his voice controlled. "It's time to go." It wasn't a request. Andrew lifted a brow. "I was having a conversation." Parker's expression didn't change. "You're done now." Theo let out a soft chuckle. "Careful, Lancaster. You almost sound possessive." Parker ignored him, turning on his heel and walking back inside. Andrew stared after him. Theo grinned. "Told you he notices." A faint crack in the armor. The car ride home was silent. Andrew expected Parker to ignore him, just like he always did. Instead, Parker finally spoke. "You should be careful who you talk to," Andrew scoffed. "Oh, are you suddenly giving me attention now?" Parker didn't rise to the bait. "Theo Sinclair isn't someone you should trust." Andrew crossed his arms. "Oh? And you are?" Parker exhaled sharply but didn't respond. Andrew let out a dry laugh. "You know what's funny? I spent all this time thinking you didn't care about me at all. But then the moment I start talking to someone else, suddenly you notice." Parker's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Andrew leaned closer. "What's wrong, Parker?" His voice was low, almost teasing. "Did it bother you?" Parker's jaw clenched. "You're imagining things." Andrew studied him for a long moment. Then, with a smirk, he leaned back in his seat. "Right," he murmured. "Of course." The first glimpse of something more. That night, Andrew left a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, his usual blend with a splash of cream. He didn't expect Parker to touch it. But the next morning, as Andrew walked into the kitchen, he found Parker standing there, holding the cup, taking a sip. For a brief second, Parker looked startled, like he had grabbed the wrong mug without thinking. Their eyes met. Parker quickly set the mug down, turning away. Andrew smirked. Interesting. A step closer to the edge. The next time Parker saw Theo, it was at another event. And this time, Parker's blue eyes darkened when Theo greeted Andrew with an easy, flirtatious smile. The mask was slipping. Andrew could see it. And if Parker thought he could keep ignoring him forever, well, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Chapter 3. Leaving you was never the plan, until it was. Andrew Monroe had always been patient. He had given Parker Lancaster every opportunity to meet him halfway, to acknowledge him, to see him. But Parker never did. Or if he did, it was only in brief, flickering moments, like when he had grabbed Andrew's coffee without thinking, or when his jaw had tensed just a little too hard at Theo's harmless flirting. Moments that were gone before Andrew could grasp them. Moments that weren't enough anymore. And so, standing in the middle of Parker's impossibly sleek penthouse, staring at the suitcase he had packed with trembling hands, Andrew finally admitted the truth to himself. He was done. A goodbye he never thought he'd say. Andrew left a note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't dramatic, just a few words. Parker, I'm leaving. Don't worry, I won't make a mess. This was never really a marriage anyway. His heart ached as he placed the pen down. He had spent months trying to crack through Parker's walls, trying to get him to see him, to care. But Parker was a man made of ice, and Andrew was tired of burning himself against the cold. He grabbed his suitcase and walked toward the door. And then, a deep voice stopped him. Where the hell do you think you're going? Andrew froze. Slowly he turned. Parker stood there, dressed in his usual crisp suit. His tie slightly loosened like he had just come from work. His blue eyes weren't cold this time. No, this time they burned. Andrew swallowed. I'm leaving, Parker. Parker's gaze flickered to the suitcase, then to the note on the counter. His expression darkened. No, he said simply. Andrew let out a bitter laugh. No? You're not leaving. Parker's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Something that sounded suspiciously like panic. Andrew lifted his chin. You don't get to decide that. Parker took a step forward. Why? His voice was sharp, demanding. Why now? Andrew exhaled, shaking his head. Because I can't do this anymore. Because I'm tired of waiting for you to care. His voice wavered. Because I don't want to be invisible anymore. Something flickered across Parker's face. For the first time, Andrew saw guilt. But he was too tired to care. Andrew turned back toward the door. And then, before he could take another step, Parker moved. Fast. Suddenly, Andrew found himself pressed against the door, Parker's hands braced on either side of him, his body caging him in. Andrew's breath caught. What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his heart hammering. Parker's blue eyes burned into his. Stopping you. Andrew scoffed. Oh, now you care? I never said I didn't, Parker snapped. Andrew's eyes widened. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. You. Andrew swallowed. You never showed me. Parker's jaw tightened. I know. His voice was quieter now, rough. But that doesn't mean I don't. He stopped himself. Andrew stared at him. Doesn't mean you don't what? Parker's hands curled into fists against the door. His breathing was uneven, his expression warring between frustration and something else, something raw. Andrew didn't move, didn't dare breathe. Parker leaned in, so close their noses almost touched. For the first time, Parker looked at him, really looked at him, like he was something precious, like he was something Parker was terrified of losing. Andrew's chest ached. Parker. Parker exhaled sharply, and then before Andrew could react, he kissed him. Not a soft, hesitant kiss, not like the cold, meaningless peck at their wedding. No, this was something desperate, something that tasted like regret, like longing, like everything Parker had never said out loud. Andrew gasped against his lips, his hands instinctively clutching at Parker's suit. He should push him away. He should remind him that it was too late. But then Parker's fingers threaded through his hair, tilting his head back, deepening the kiss. And suddenly, nothing else mattered. When Parker finally pulled away, Andrew's knees felt weak. His lips were swollen, his breath uneven, his mind a mess. Parker's hand was still in his hair, his forehead resting against Andrew's. Andrew swallowed. What was that? Parker was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Don't go." Andrew's eyes fluttered shut. God, he wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that this meant something. But, "I can't stay just because of a kiss, Parker," Andrew whispered. Parker's grip on him tightened. "It's not just a kiss," he said hoarsely. Andrew's heart clenched. "Then prove it," he wanted to say. "Show me I matter. Show me this isn't just some reaction to the idea of losing me." But he was afraid of the answer. So instead, he gently pushed Parker away. "I need time," Andrew murmured. Parker's jaw clenched, but he nodded. And so, for the first time since their wedding, Andrew walked away. But this time, Parker wasn't going to let him go so easily. The morning after. Andrew had barely been gone a day when Parker cracked. Sleep was impossible. Work was unbearable. Every time he walked into the penthouse, it felt wrong. Andrew's absence was suffocating, and Parker hated it. Hated the way his chest ached. Hated the way his throat felt tight whenever he thought about Andrew leaving. "You did this to yourself," a voice in his head sneered. And maybe it was right. Maybe he had ruined everything. But Parker Lancaster had never been the kind of man to give up. So the next evening, against all reason, he found himself standing outside Andrew's friend's apartment. Heart pounding, knuckles clenched, and for the first time in his life, Parker was afraid. Chapter 4. Chasing What Was Almost Lost. Parker Lancaster had never chased anyone in his life. People came to him. That was how it had always been. Yet here he was, standing outside Andrew's friend's apartment like some desperate man with nowhere else to go. And maybe he was desperate. Maybe he had been a fool for thinking Andrew would always be there, waiting for him to figure himself out. Maybe he had already lost the only person who had ever made his life feel anything but empty. The thought made his chest feel unbearably tight. Before he could talk himself out of it, he knocked. The door opened a few seconds later, revealing Andrew's friend, Leo, if Parker remembered correctly. The guy had an easy grin, a little too much interest in Andrew, and an obvious disapproval of Parker. "Ah," Leo said, leaning against the doorframe. "The Ice King himself. What do you want?" Parker clenched his jaw. "Where's Andrew?" Leo smirked. "Not here." Parker's fingers curled into fists. "Then where?" "Relax, Lancaster. He's out running errands, but even if he was here, I wouldn't just hand him over to you." Parker exhaled sharply. "I need to talk to him." Leo crossed his arms. "Oh, now you want to talk?" Parker didn't respond. Leo studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, man, I don't know what your deal is, but Andrew's been miserable for months. He deserves better than whatever game you're playing." "I'm not playing a game." Parker's voice was quiet, but firm. Leo tilted his head. "A little late for that, don't you think?" Parker's throat tightened. Maybe it was. But he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when he had finally realized just how much he needed Andrew. Leo let out a long breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, if you're serious about fixing this, then prove it, but don't you dare hurt him again." Parker met his gaze. "I won't." Leo studied him for another long moment, then stepped back. "Then go find him." Parker didn't waste another second. A drunken confession. Parker found Andrew at the small cafe he liked. He had always known Andrew spent time here, sketching or drinking his ridiculous caramel lattes, but he had never actually bothered to come with him. Now he wished he had. Andrew sat at a corner table, completely focused on his sketchbook. The setting sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow on his auburn hair, highlighting the soft curve of his jaw. For a moment, Parker just watched. How had he been so blind? How had he spent months pretending he didn't want this? Want him. Parker took a slow, steadying breath, then walked forward. Andrew looked up at the sound of footsteps. The moment he saw Parker, his eyes widened. "Parker?" Parker swallowed. "Hey!" Andrew blinked. What are you doing here?" Parker hesitated. Then, before he could lose his nerve, he said, "I need to talk to you." Andrew frowned, glancing around. "Here?" Parker exhaled. "No, somewhere private." Andrew studied him for a long moment. Then finally he sighed and grabbed his things. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's go." Taking a step forward. They ended up in Andrew's temporary apartment. Andrew set down his sketchbook and crossed his arms. All right, talk. Parker hesitated. He had planned what to say. He had rehearsed it in his head. But now, standing in front of Andrew, all those carefully prepared words felt wrong, too shallow, too rehearsed. So instead, he spoke the only truth that mattered. I don't want to lose you. Andrew's breath caught. Parker clenched his fists. I know I screwed up. I know I've been cold, distant, and I know you deserve better than that. His voice faltered. But I need you to understand something. I never wanted this marriage to be just a business deal. I didn't know how to be what you needed. Andrew's expression softened, but he didn't speak. Parker swallowed. But I want to try, if you'll let me. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Andrew spoke. You hurt me, Parker. His voice was quiet, but firm. For months I felt like I didn't even exist to you. Parker flinched. I know. I kept waiting for you to see me, Andrew continued, to care, and now, all of a sudden, you do? He let out a shaky breath. Why now? Parker exhaled. Because I was an idiot. And because when you left, I realized something. Andrew raised a brow. Oh? Parker stepped closer. That my life without you in it feels wrong. Andrew's lips parted slightly. Parker took another step. That I miss you. That I want you. That I... His voice wavered. That I need you. Andrew's eyes glistened. And for the first time since their wedding, Parker saw it. Hope. Andrew licked his lips. Parker. Parker reached for him hesitantly, his fingers brushing against Andrew's. Please. His voice was raw, unsteady. Give me a chance to fix this. Andrew searched his face. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, Okay. The first real date. It was awkward at first. Parker had never dated anyone before, but he tried. And Andrew let him. They started small, a late-night drive, just the two of them. No press, no business dinners, just them, talking about nothing and everything. Then came the little things. Parker waiting for Andrew to wake up before leaving for work. Andrew bringing Parker coffee even when he swore he didn't drink it. Parker watching Andrew paint, fascinated in a way he never admitted. And then, one evening, after getting caught in the rain, after laughing for the first time in forever, Parker kissed him again. And this time, Andrew kissed him back. Chapter 5. The Fire That Had Always Been There. Parker Lancaster wasn't used to feeling. His world had always been built on logic, on control, on carefully constructed walls that kept everyone at arm's length. But Andrew Monroe had slipped past those defenses, had burned through them, leaving Parker standing in the ashes of everything he had thought he understood about himself. And now there was no more pretending. No more denying the fire that had always been there between them. Breaking the tension. The night started with rain. It had been drizzling when they left the art class Andrew had started teaching, but by the time they reached Parker's car, the skies had opened up, drenching them both in seconds. God, this is ridiculous. Andrew laughed, shaking his wet hair out of his eyes as they sprinted into Parker's penthouse. Parker wasn't laughing. His gaze was locked on Andrew, on the way his soaked shirt clung to his frame, the way droplets ran down the curve of his neck. Andrew noticed. His hazel eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he tugged at the hem of his wet shirt. I need to change before I get sick. Parker nodded, throat dry. Yeah. Andrew turned to head toward his room. Their room now, because he had officially moved back in. But before he could disappear down the hall, Parker grabbed his wrist. Andrew froze. Slowly, he turned back. Parker? Parker's grip tightened slightly. He could feel the warmth of Andrew's skin beneath his fingertips, the faint tremble of his pulse. He had spent so long holding back, so long pretending he wasn't completely and utterly consumed by this man. But tonight, he wasn't holding back anymore. Undeniable attraction. Parker stepped closer. Stay. Andrew's breath hitched. What? Stay? Parker repeated, his voice lower now, rougher. He reached for the hem of Andrew's soaked shirt, fingers brushing against damp fabric. Let me help. Andrew swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between Parker's eyes and his mouth. And then, slowly, he lifted his arms. Parker didn't hesitate. He peeled the wet fabric off of Andrew, his hands skimming over warm, damp skin. He hadn't touched him like this before, not really, but it felt natural. Like something they had been building toward since the moment they met. Andrew inhaled sharply as Parker's fingers traced his bare shoulders. Parker. Parker's hand slid lower, learning, memorizing. Tell me to stop, Parker murmured, voice hoarse. Andrew's lips parted. He didn't say a word. Instead, he surged forward, closing the space between them, his mouth crashing into Parker's. And suddenly, nothing else mattered. The kiss was fire. Desperate, deep, long overdue. Parker groaned into Andrew's mouth, pulling him closer, their bodies aligning like they had been made for this, made for each other. Andrew's fingers tangled in Parker's dark hair, tugging just enough to make Parker gasp against his lips. Parker felt possessed, shattered, rebuilt all at once. He had spent so long keeping his distance, so long fighting this. Now, he was losing himself in Andrew, and for once, he didn't want to be found. Passion ignites, hands roamed, mouths explored, breaths mingled between fevered kisses. It wasn't just about desire, it was so much more. It was months of longing, months of unspoken words, unresolved tension, months of Parker pretending he didn't need this, didn't need him. Now there was no pretending. Now there was only them. And when Parker finally pulled back, breathing ragged, lips swollen, eyes dark, Andrew just smirked. "Took you long enough," he whispered. Parker grinned, something real, something unrestrained. Then, with a low growl, he kissed him again, and this time, he didn't stop. Morning after. The next morning, Parker woke up to warmth. For the first time in forever, he wasn't waking up alone. Andrew was curled against him, hair a mess, breathing slow and even. Parker didn't move, didn't dare break the fragile peace of this moment. Instead, he studied him, taking in every little detail. The faint freckles scattered across his nose, the way his lips were slightly parted, like he had been about to say something in his sleep, the way his hand was resting over Parker's chest, like it belonged there. Parker had never been good at emotions, but right now, he knew one thing for certain. He never wanted to wake up without Andrew beside him again. A love that couldn't be ignored. When Andrew finally stirred, blinking up at him sleepily, Parker did something he had never done before. He brushed a kiss over his forehead. Andrew's eyes widened slightly. "Are you cuddling me right now?" Parker scoffed. "Shut up." Andrew grinned, stretching like a satisfied cat. "You are Parker Lancaster. The emotionally repressed CEO is—" Parker silenced him with a kiss. Andrew melted into it instantly, sighing against his lips, his fingers curling into Parker's hair. When Parker finally pulled back, Andrew was breathless. "Okay, fine," Andrew murmured, cheeks slightly flushed. "You win." Parker smirked. "I always do." Andrew rolled his eyes, but snuggled closer. And Parker just held him tighter. Because for the first time in his life, he had finally won something that actually mattered. Chapter 6, Love the Kind You Fight For. Parker Lancaster had built his life around control. Control over his business, control over his emotions, control over his future. But Andrew Monroe? Andrew was chaos, wrapped in laughter, sharp words, and a stubborn heart that refused to be ignored. And Parker, against all logic, against everything he had once believed about himself, had fallen for him completely. A relationship in progress. The transition from strangers in a marriage to whatever they were now wasn't smooth. Parker had never been in a real relationship before. He didn't know how to do the little things, the morning kisses, the teasing touches, the way Andrew expected him to just talk instead of bottling everything up. Andrew, on the other hand, was the opposite. He felt everything deeply, spoke his mind without hesitation, and loved without fear. So, naturally, there were growing pains, like when Parker forgot to text back after meetings, assuming Andrew would just know he was busy, only to get an annoyed, "I may love you, but I'm not a damn psychic, Parker." Or when Andrew reorganized Parker's entire kitchen without warning because you had your spices in alphabetical order, you lunatic. Who does that? Or when Parker caught Andrew flirting with the barista at his favorite cafe. And, okay, that one was a problem. A surprise jealous streak. It happened during one of their Saturday coffee runs. Parker usually let Andrew order for both of them because apparently Parker was too intimidating for customer service workers. But today Parker walked in just in time to hear Andrew laughing at something the barista, a man with dimples and way too white teeth, had said. "Oh, come on," the guy was saying, grinning at Andrew. "You can't tell me a guy as cute as you doesn't have dozens of admirers." Andrew chuckled, leaning on the counter. "Well, there's only one that really matters, but—" Parker stepped right behind Andrew, voice low. "He better be the only one." Andrew stiffened slightly before turning to look at Parker, amusement flickering in his hazel eyes. "Parker." Parker ignored the barista, who was suddenly very interested in the espresso machine, and just stared at Andrew. "You're mine," he murmured, just loud enough for Andrew to hear. Andrew raised a brow. "Jealous, are we?" Parker didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned in, pressing a lingering kiss to the side of Andrew's neck, just enough to prove a point. Andrew's breath hitched, his fingers tightening around his cup. Parker smirked. "Let's go." Andrew groaned. "You really need to work on handling emotions like a normal person." But he followed Parker out, without looking back at the barista once. So, Parker called that a win gesture. Parker wasn't good with words, but actions, that he could do. So when Andrew's art program announced a private gallery exhibition, Parker made arrangements. He rented out an entire gallery space, arranged the perfect lighting, and invited the right people, not business executives, not socialites, but real art lovers, people who would actually see Andrew's work the way it deserved to be seen. And when Andrew walked in that night, expecting some small, casual event, only to see his paintings displayed in a breathtaking gallery setting, he stopped breathing for a second. "Parker," he whispered, staring around in awe. You did this?" Parker stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You deserve it." Andrew turned to him, eyes shining. His voice broke slightly. Parker reached for him, threading their fingers together. "I see you," Parker murmured. "I always have." And that was the moment Andrew knew that Parker wasn't just saying the words, knew that Parker wasn't going to let him go again, knew that them, was real. An unexpected proposal, this time out of love. A week later, Parker slid a small velvet box across the dining table. Andrew frowned, picking it up. "What's this?" Parker sipped his coffee. "Open it." Andrew narrowed his eyes before flipping the lid open and froze. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a ring. Not just any ring, a new ring. Not the cold, impersonal one they had exchanged at their arranged wedding. This one was different. It was simple, elegant, designed with Andrew in mind. Andrew swallowed thickly. "Parker?" Parker's gaze was steady. "Marry me." Andrew let out a breathless laugh. "We are married." Parker smirked. "Then say yes anyway." Andrew stared at him for a long moment, and then, with a teasing smile and misty eyes, he said yes. The answer, this time, is a kiss. The moment the words left Andrew's mouth, Parker pulled him in. The kiss was slow, deep, full of everything they hadn't said before. Parker's fingers traced the line of Andrew's jaw, tilting his head, deepening the kiss, until Andrew was breathless. When they finally pulled apart, Andrew's lips were slightly swollen, his eyes dark with something dangerous and inviting. "Well," Andrew murmured, smirking, "I guess we should celebrate properly." Parker's own smirk was slow, wicked. "I was thinking the same thing." And when Andrew grabbed him by the collar, dragging him toward their bedroom, Parker didn't resist. Not even a little. Epilogue. And so he kept me. Andrew Monroe woke up to warmth. Not just the kind that came from the sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows, but the kind that came from Parker Lancaster's arms wrapped tightly around him. For the first time since their wedding, Andrew felt completely at home. He shifted slightly, rolling over to face Parker, who was still asleep. And God, he looked so different like this. Gone was the cold, untouchable CEO. Instead, Andrew saw the real Parker, the one who had learned how to love, the one who had fought to keep him, the one who, if Andrew was honest, he had loved all along. A scene of domestic bliss. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as Andrew leaned against the counter watching Parker fumble with the French press. It was almost comical. Parker Lancaster, billionaire CEO, emotionally stunted grump, was trying to make him breakfast, and failing miserably. Andrew smirked. "You know, you could just let me cook." Parker shot him a glare, lips twitching. "Shut up." Andrew grinned. "You're adorable when you're trying to be domestic." Parker grumbled under his breath, but didn't stop. He flipped the pancakes with an almost impressive level of concentration, until one of them landed halfway off the pan. Andrew burst out laughing. Parker scowled. "I hate you." "No, you don't," Andrew teased, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around Parker's waist. "You love me." Parker exhaled, leaning back slightly into Andrew's embrace. "Unfortunately." Andrew laughed, pressing a soft kiss to the back of Parker's neck. And just like that, Parker melted. Because as much as he pretended to be grumpy, he was a complete goner when it came to Andrew. A final tease. Later that afternoon, they found themselves curled up on the couch, Andrew sketching absent-mindedly, Parker reading through emails. It was peaceful. Easy. Then, out of nowhere, Andrew murmured, "You know, maybe I should threaten to leave more often." Parker froze. Slowly, dangerously, he looked up. "What?" Andrew smirked, flipping a page in his sketchbook. "I'm just saying, if it gets me grand gestures, romantic confessions, and a new ring every time, maybe I should." Parker grabbed the sketchbook, tossed it onto the coffee table, and pinned Andrew to the couch in one swift movement. Andrew gasped. "Parker." Parker leaned in, his voice a low growl against Andrew's ear. "Don't you dare." Andrew shivered, his smirk faltering slightly. "I was kidding." Parker nipped at his jaw, making him gasp. "Still think it's funny?" Parker murmured. Andrew was flustered now, his breath uneven. "No," Parker smirked. "Good." And then, just to prove his point, he kissed him breathless. The last line. Later that night, as they lay tangled together in bed, Andrew whispered, "So what happens now?" Parker pressed a kiss to his temple. "Now? We live." Andrew smiled. Parker pulled him closer, voice low and certain. "And you stay, because I'm never letting you go again." Andrew sighed, content and warm. "Good," he whispered, because neither was he. And so he kept me. A happy, passionate ending. The end. Chapter 1. The car stopped with a jolt, its tires crunching the gravel of the long, winding driveway that led to the Delacroix estate. Alan stared out the window, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The mansion rose like a forgotten relic from a different century, perched on the edge of a cliff that overlooked the restless ocean below. Its stone walls were weather-worn, its windows tall and dark, like hollow eyes. Ivy crawled across its facade, as though the house itself had been trying to disappear into the earth. Alan stepped out, the wind catching his coat and tussling his chestnut hair. He looked up at the building, resisting the urge to shiver. There was nothing warm about this place, nothing welcoming. "Don't keep them waiting," the driver muttered, nodding toward the iron gates. Alan walked alone through the arched entrance, dragging behind him a suitcase that felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the weight of clothes or belongings. It was the weight of everything he was leaving behind. His freedom, his pride, his life, as he'd known it. The deal had been simple. His father's debts were to be erased if Alan agreed to marry the heir of the Delacroix estate. A recluse, they'd whispered. A man in a wheelchair who hadn't been seen in public since the accident. Alan hadn't even known his name until the contract was signed. Now, as the old wooden doors creaked open, Alan met the estate's first set of eyes. "You must be Alan," said a stern voice. An older woman stood at the threshold, her silver bun tucked so tightly that it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She held her hands clasped over her apron and did not smile. "I'm Mrs. Dahlia," she added. "Housekeeper of the estate. Come with me." She turned before he could answer, and Alan followed her through endless hallways of cold marble, faded portraits, and locked doors. The place smelled like lavender and old books. Everything was silent, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Where's Jackson?" Alan asked, his voice uncertain. Mrs. Dahlia didn't turn around. "He'll be at the ceremony, if he feels up to it." That wasn't comforting. The garden ceremony was held in a withering courtyard tangled in wild roses and vines. A single arch had been decorated with white cloth, and a minister stood waiting, looking like he regretted agreeing to this gig. The only other people in attendance were a handful of stiff-looking estate staff, and one man in an expensive suit who stood by the wine table with a smirk on his face. "Thomas Delacroix," he introduced himself, holding out a hand as Alan approached. "Cousin of the groom, the one actually keeping this place running while Jackson broods." Alan shook his hand. It was cold and firm, like everything else in this place. Thomas leaned in. You don't have to try too hard, you know. No one expects this to be real, least of all him. Alan was about to ask what he meant when a hush fell over the courtyard. Heads turned. Jackson had arrived. He was being wheeled in by a silent man in black. His posture was regal, back straight, shoulders proud, even-seated. He wore a tailored black suit with silver cufflinks, but his face was unreadable. His dark hair was combed back, the streaks of silver near his temples striking against his tan skin. His eyes, however, were the most unforgettable part. Piercing blue, sharp and distant, as if he saw through everything and cared for none of it. He didn't greet Alan. Didn't look at him, just wheeled up to the altar and said nothing. The vows were read aloud. Alan spoke his part, voice trembling. Jackson didn't respond. He just gave a curt nod when prompted. No kiss followed, no ring exchange. The minister stammered something about legality, then excused himself as fast as humanly possible. The newlyweds stood side by side in silence. Alan glanced sideways. You could have at least pretended to be happy. Jackson turned his head slowly, like it took effort. Would that have made this less humiliating for you? Alan's cheeks flushed. You could try not to be a complete ass. Jackson's lips twitched. That would require me to care, which I don't. Then he turned and wheeled himself away, leaving Alan alone under the arch of dying roses. That night, Alan found his room on the opposite side of the mansion. It was large, drafty, and far too clean. Like no one had ever really lived in it. He stared at the bed for a while, still in his wedding suit, wondering what he was supposed to feel. Angry? Humiliated? Trapped? All of it fit. But under that, a strange spark of curiosity flickered. Who was Jackson Delacroix, really? And why did he seem like a man carved from stone? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mrs. Dahlia stood outside with a tray of food, chicken broth, and buttered toast, like he was sick. You'll eat here, she said. His schedule is different. His schedule? We're married. She gave him a look, not unkind, but guarded. Marriage doesn't mean much in this house, dear. Then she left, the door clicking shut behind her. The hours passed slowly. The mansion grew darker. Alan couldn't sleep. The walls seemed to creak with secrets, and the wind howled through the cliffside windows. Restless, he pulled on a hoodie and wandered the hallways, his footsteps echoing. He found the library by accident. It was hidden behind double doors at the end of a hall, softly lit by wall sconces. Alan stepped inside and froze. There, in the center of the room, sat Jackson. His wheelchair was pulled up to a grand piano, his back to the door. His fingers moved over the keys with quiet precision. The melody was slow and aching, like a memory sung in notes. Alan stood in the doorway, breath caught in his throat. Jackson paused suddenly, sensing him. He turned slightly but didn't stop playing. You shouldn't sneak around, he said, voice low. I wasn't sneaking. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Right. Just wandering through private rooms after midnight. Very innocent. Alan crossed his arms. This is my house now, too, isn't it? Jackson didn't respond. His fingers kept playing. You're really good, Alan said softly. I used to be better. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the piano. Then Jackson spoke without looking at him. You can go back to your wing now. I've fulfilled the contract. You're safe. You don't have to try. Alan's jaw clenched. Maybe I'm not trying for you. He turned and walked out before Jackson could reply. But long after he returned to his room, the melody stayed with him, haunting and beautiful, just like the man who played it. Chapter 2. He's not who I thought he was. The days passed in an odd sort of limbo. Alan woke up to the sound of seagulls, had breakfast in silence, roamed the mansion's endless hallways, and occasionally encountered Jackson like one might encounter a ghost. Unexpectedly and with a chill that lingered long after. Jackson wasn't cruel. He was worse, polite, sarcastic, and detached. Every conversation was a battle, every glance a guarded one. But Alan, who had never enjoyed losing, was beginning to adapt. So what do you do all day, Your Majesty? Alan asked one morning over tea, sprawled on a bench in the overgrown garden. Jackson glanced up from his book, the sun hitting his cheekbones, making his pale eyes even sharper. I breathe. Occasionally blink. Sometimes I pretend people like you aren't speaking. Alan snorted. Wow, that's riveting. You should write a memoir. How to Sulk with Elegance. Jackson's lip curled slightly. Not quite a smile. You assume I sulk. Maybe I just enjoy peace. You live in a haunted house with locked doors and no guests, Alan replied. Your definition of peace sounds like a horror movie. Their banter had become a strange kind of ritual. At first, Alan had been too humiliated to talk back. But now he looked forward to these verbal sparring matches. It was the only time Jackson showed any signs of life. Rumors had begun trickling in, courtesy of Mrs. Dahlia, who spoke in half-whispers when she thought Alan wasn't listening. 2 years ago, Jackson had been in a car accident. Word around the estate said he had been driving at breakneck speed to stop an engagement, a marriage arranged by the Delacroix board for political ties. He hadn't wanted it. Neither had his late brother, who had been in the passenger seat that night. The brother hadn't survived. Alan didn't know if the story was true, but something in Jackson's eyes made it feel like it might be. On a rainy afternoon, bored and restless, Alan took to exploring the attic. The upper levels of the mansion were even more forgotten than the rest, dusty, untouched, full of cupboard furniture and boxes no one had dared open in years. Behind an old bookshelf, he found it, a small room, slanted ceilings, a huge window overlooking the sea, and canvases, dozens of them. Half-finished paintings, brushes hardened with old color, a sketchbook full of wild lines and emotions that seemed to spill off the page. The studio was abandoned, but not forgotten. Alan stood there, stunned, heart-pounding. The air smelled like turpentine and dust and grief. He returned the next day, and the one after that. Soon he was painting again, pouring out everything he hadn't said into canvas and color. He didn't tell anyone. It was his one untouched space, his own rebellion. Until, of course, Jackson found him. You know, breaking and entering isn't as charming as you think, Jackson said, rolling into the attic one evening without warning. Alan froze mid-brushstroke. How did you even get up here? Jackson gestured behind him. There's a lift. I had it installed before I decided I hated everyone. Alan put the brush down. I'll leave. But Jackson didn't move. His gaze had locked onto the painting Alan had been working on, a chaotic swirl of blues and reds and fragmented figures reaching toward a fractured sun. You paint like you're drowning, Jackson murmured. Alan blinked. Is that a compliment or a critique? Jackson turned to leave. Both. Their strange routines began to evolve. Jackson invited Alan to the study one evening with a chessboard already set. Alan had never played before, but Jackson had the smug patience of someone who had too much time to be good at everything. Alan lost every game, but each defeat lit a fire in him. Don't gloat, Alan grumbled after his fourth checkmate. I don't gloat, Jackson said, arranging the pieces again. I bask, quietly. Alan narrowed his eyes. You're evil. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You married me, darling. Alan laughed, an honest, bright sound that startled them both. In retaliation, Alan began dragging Jackson into the garden every morning. Literally. I'm not going, Jackson warned the first time. You are, Alan replied, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair. You're kidnapping me. I'm sunlight therapying you. Mrs. Dahlia nearly dropped a tray the first time she saw Jackson in the garden, but no one stopped them. The sea air did something to Jackson's face. His jaw unclenched. His eyes softened. He looked for a moment, like the man he might have been before the accident. Alan noticed, and it made something twist painfully in his chest. One night, the sky split open with thunder. Alan had always liked storms, but something about this one felt wrong. The wind howled like a warning, the windows shook in their frames, and the air crackled with a kind of weight. He was halfway down the hall when he heard it. Breathless, fast breathing. A choked sound. A clatter. He turned the corner and found Jackson slumped in his wheelchair in the middle of the hall, eyes wide, hands gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles were white. Jackson? Jackson didn't answer. His chest rose and fell too fast. His gaze was fixed somewhere else. Some other time. Some night on a road with screeching tires and blood in the air. Alan dropped to his knees beside him. Hey, you're here. You're safe. Just breathe with me, okay? Still no answer. So Alan just stayed there, quiet, present, breathing slow and deep. Eventually Jackson's grip loosened, his shoulders sagged. The storm outside raged on, but the one inside seemed to pass. I'm sorry, Jackson whispered, not meeting his eyes. Alan shook his head. Don't be. Jackson turned away. I hate being like this. Alan touched his arm gently. Then be something else. You're not just that moment. Jackson didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. The next day, a new guest arrived. Claire. Blonde, elegant, and smiling like she belonged there. She swept into the estate in heels that clicked like declarations and kissed Jackson on both cheeks like they were still 17. "Alan, was it?" she asked sweetly. "Jackson didn't tell me you were so adorable." Alan smiled back. "He didn't tell me you existed." Claire laughed too loudly and slid her arm through Jackson's. "We were inseparable once. I was going to marry him, you know, before everything." She didn't have to say more. Alan already hated her. Jackson, to his credit, looked supremely uninterested. But Claire stayed the night, and she stayed too long. That evening, as Alan passed the drawing room, he heard her whispering to Jackson in the shadows. "You could still leave, you know. This marriage doesn't have to mean anything." Not really. Alan didn't stop walking, but his heart did. That night, Alan couldn't sleep. At around 2 in the morning, he heard the quiet creak of wheels in the hallway. He got up and peeked out. Jackson was there, moving slowly down the corridor, lost in thought. His shoulders hunched, his head bowed. He was murmuring something under his breath. A name. Alan strained to hear. Caleb. Not Claire. Not even close. Alan stood silently in the doorway as Jackson disappeared into the dark, and the pieces began to shift into place. He's not who I thought he was. And maybe, Alan realized, neither am I. Chapter 3. The mansion's secrets. And ours. Alan wasn't looking for secrets. He had only wanted a book. A specific one, about coastal herbs, because Mrs. Dahlia had started letting him help in the kitchen, and he was determined to impress her by not mistaking rosemary for seaweed again. But the Delacroix Library had a mind of its own. He tugged at a thick, dusty volume wedged behind a marble bust of a poet, and something gave way behind it. A faint clicking sound. The entire shelf creaked, shifting slightly outward with a groan like the house itself disapproved. Behind the row of books was a hidden compartment. Inside, a stack of letters tied with a black ribbon, brittle with age, their edges yellowed. Alan hesitated, then pulled them free. They were addressed to Caleb Delacroix. The name made his heart skip. The same name Jackson had murmured in the hall that night. Alan sat down in the nearest chair and unfolded the top letter. It was written in a rushed, desperate hand. "Caleb, I know this isn't the life you wanted, and I'm sorry I'm dragging you into it. But I can't let them force me into marrying someone for appearances. If I don't make it to the meeting in time, if something happens, please forgive me." There was no signature, but Alan didn't need one. It had been Jackson. The letter was a confession, unfinished, unmailed, written the day of the accident, perhaps hours before. Alan stared at it for a long time, his throat tight. Whatever had happened that night, Jackson had been running from more than a marriage. He had been running toward something. Someone. And he'd lost both. Alan didn't confront Jackson, not yet. Instead, he channeled his energy into poking the other wolf in the den. Thomas. Alan had begun to notice strange inconsistencies. Missing ledgers, delayed maintenance on the estate despite funds allocated, quiet whispers from staff who fell silent when Thomas entered a room. So he cornered him in the solarium, mid-sip of an expensive scotch. "You've been using the estate's funds for personal investments," Alan said, casually flipping through a folder of copied ledgers he'd found in the dusty archive room. "That's not just unethical, it's illegal." Thomas raised an eyebrow, but the smirk on his lips faltered. "And who do you think is going to believe you?" he sneered. "You're just the decorative husband. Maybe, but I've got Jackson's signature now." Alan slid a form across the table, granting me access to all financial documentation as a legal spouse. "You might want to start packing." Thomas stood. "You don't know what you're doing." "Actually," Alan said with a faint smile, "I think I do." Later that evening, Jackson found him in the library. "You confronted him," Jackson said simply. Alan looked up from the fireplace. "I did." A pause. Jackson rolled closer, the firelight catching the silver in his dark hair. "I'd suspected for months," he said quietly, "but I didn't have the energy to fight him. Not after everything." Alan studied his face. "You mean Caleb?" Jackson froze. Alan rose, crossed the room, and gently handed him the letter he'd found. "I didn't mean to find it," Alan said, "but I'm glad I did." Jackson held the letter like it might burn him. His eyes didn't meet Alan's. "I was driving," he said after a long silence. "I told him I needed to stop the wedding. He insisted on coming with me, said he'd cover for me if I didn't make it in time. We fought in the car. I lost focus. Alan's throat tightened. I woke up in the hospital, Jackson continued, paralyzed, alone, and Caleb was gone. He looked up finally, eyes filled with a pain so raw it made Alan ache. They blamed me? The board, my parents, even Claire. Did you blame yourself? Alan asked. Jackson didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at his hands. Strong, elegant, still stained with invisible scars. Every single day. Alan reached out and touched his hand, gently, without pressure, just warmth. Jackson didn't pull away. 2 days later, Alan wheeled Jackson out of the mansion and down the winding path toward the cliffs. This is madness, Jackson grumbled. You don't even know if the brakes on this thing work. We're not going base jumping, just getting fish and chips like normal people. You really believe we're normal? Alan grinned. Nope, but I believe in deep-fried potatoes and sunburns. The seaside village was quaint, its streets cobbled and crooked, with shops that sold everything from seashells to antique maps. People stared, of course they did, but Jackson sat straighter in his chair than Alan had ever seen him. They ate by the harbor, laughing over greasy food wrapped in paper. Alan teased Jackson for dipping his fries in vinegar. Jackson rolled his eyes and stole half of Alan's. And for the first time, Jackson smiled. A real, slow, unguarded smile. Alan thought it might be the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. But peace in the Delacroix house never lasted long. Claire returned. She swept through the front doors in a designer coat, her heels echoing like gunshots on the marble floor. I hear you've been playing husband and savior, she said sweetly to Alan in the foyer. How noble. Alan said nothing. He didn't trust her enough to speak. Claire leaned in, her voice low. You do realize he only agreed to marry you because of the inheritance clause, right? His lawyers insisted on a spouse to keep the board happy. Love had nothing to do with it. Alan's fists clenched. Later that night, after pacing the halls like a caged animal, he found Jackson alone in the study. I have one question, Alan said, voice tight, and I want the truth. Jackson looked up. Ask. Why did you marry me? A pause. Jackson's expression shifted, carefully blank, because it made sense. Alan's breath caught. That's it? I needed a way to keep the board off my back. Your father owed money. It was mutually beneficial. We both got what we needed. The words landed like stones. Alan swallowed hard. Right, of course. He turned to leave, but Jackson's voice stopped him. Alan. No, Alan snapped. You don't get to do that. You don't get to pull me into your world, let me care about you, and then push me away like I'm just a pawn in your stupid inheritance game. Jackson's eyes darkened. Don't pretend you're some tragic hero in all this. You came here to save yourself. I came here because I had to. But I stayed because of you. Alan's voice broke. Jackson didn't speak. Alan took a step back, his vision blurry. You know what the worst part is? He said, laughing bitterly. I actually thought I was helping you heal. Then he left. This time, he didn't go to his room. He didn't go to the attic or the garden or the library. He walked out the front door. The night air hit him like a slap, salty, cold, and real. The cliff path was slick beneath his shoes, but he didn't care. He needed space. He needed air. He needed to not feel like he was unraveling from the inside out. He sat on a stone bench at the edge of the estate grounds, the sea crashing below, stars spinning above. And for the first time since arriving, he cried. Not for the debt, not for the contract, but for Jackson, for the man with the broken heart, the haunted eyes, and the walls too thick to see through. And because, despite everything, Alan had started to fall in love with him. Chapter 4. I Can't Pretend I Don't Care Anymore. The village just beyond the cliffs bustled with a kind of cheerful ignorance that made Alan feel both comforted and out of place. He'd spent most of the day wandering its narrow cobbled streets, avoiding texts, ignoring the guilt that clung to his coat like salt from the sea breeze. He didn't want to think about the mansion, about Jackson, about the sharp words they'd thrown like knives. He'd needed air, but the break didn't last long. As Alan passed a small cafe window, a headline on the local newspaper stand caught his eye, and his blood ran cold. Delacroix cousin in talks to sell estate. Source, legal challenges underway for conservatorship. Alan didn't finish reading. He snatched the paper, shoved a few coins at the vendor, and ran. The estate looked the same when he arrived, but it felt wrong. quieter, like something inside had been pulled loose. He burst through the doors, heart pounding, and immediately went looking for Mrs. Dahlia. She met him in the hallway with a tight, pale face. "Where is he?" Alan demanded. "Where's Jackson?" "In his room," she said quietly. "But he's not well. He hasn't eaten, not since you left." Alan's stomach dropped. He stormed past her down the hall through the double doors into Jackson's wing. The curtains were drawn. The air smelled faintly of medication and silence. Jackson sat in his chair by the window, still as stone. His eyes didn't move when Alan entered. "Do you know what your cousin is doing?" Alan snapped. "He's trying to have you declared mentally unfit." Jackson didn't respond. Alan crossed the room, crouching in front of him. "You haven't eaten. You look like hell." Jackson's voice was hoarse. "You left. I was angry. You were right to be." Alan stood up, furious. "No, I wasn't right. I was hurt. Because I thought—" He stopped himself. He swallowed. "Let me help you. Just let me do something." Jackson didn't argue. Alan brought him water, soup, sat beside him while he ate small bites in silence. He checked the temperature on his forehead, refolded the blanket around his legs, and tried to ignore how shaky his hands were. For a long time, Jackson just stared at him. Then, quietly, "I shouldn't have said what I did." Alan didn't speak. Jackson sighed, voice low. "The truth is, I knew who you were before the marriage." Alan turned to him slowly. "I read your blog," Jackson admitted. "The one you used to post paintings on. The one no one read but me." Alan blinked. "You what?" "I found it by accident, years ago, when I was still in recovery. I couldn't paint anymore, but I could still look. You wrote things I didn't know how to say. You painted like you were bleeding and didn't mind." Alan's chest tightened. "I thought if I married someone I already admired, maybe I wouldn't feel like everything had been taken from me," Jackson said. "But then you got here and you were real and angry and alive, and I didn't know what to do with that." Alan shook his head, overwhelmed. "You could have just told me. I was scared you'd leave, then I made sure you did." The tension that had hung between them for weeks broke like glass under pressure. Alan moved to speak, but the words tangled behind emotion. "I hated you at first," Jackson whispered, "because I wanted to want no one. It was easier." Alan stepped forward, voice rough. "Well, I hated you because you were impossible, condescending, infuriating. Still am. Still are." And just like that, they were kissing. It wasn't soft or cautious. It was hungry, clumsy, desperate. Alan leaned down, Jackson pulled him in, and the world narrowed to lips and breath and the ache of finally crossing that line. When they parted, foreheads pressed together, Jackson whispered, "I still want you to stay." Alan closed his eyes. "Good, because I'm not leaving again." But peace didn't last long in Alan's world. The next morning, as he was helping Mrs. Dahlia with breakfast, a knock came at the front door. A familiar one, sharp, demanding. Alan opened it to find Marco, his older brother, disheveled, smug, and reeking of cheap cologne and entitlement. "Baby brother," Marco said, grinning. "Long time no see." Alan stiffened. "What do you want?" "Is that any way to greet family?" "I just came to see how you were doing. You know, after selling yourself into marriage to pay off Dad's debts. Really noble, by the way." Alan started to close the door, but Marco blocked it with his foot. "Hey, relax. I'm just saying, since you're all buddy-buddy with the money now, maybe it's time you return the favor. I've got some things I need help with." "Get out, Marco." But Marco didn't budge. A new voice rang out behind Alan. "If he doesn't leave, I'll have the security team escort him off the grounds." Jackson. He wheeled up beside Alan, gaze like steel. Marco scoffed. "And you're the husband. Cute. Thought you were just the furniture." Jackson rolled closer until he was almost chest to chest with Marco. "Touch him, insult him, or breathe near him again, and I'll make sure you regret it." Marco laughed, but it was nervous now. "You Delacroix types are all the same, thinking you can scare people off with big words and bigger wallets." "I don't need either," Jackson said. "I have lawyers and claws." Alan watched in stunned silence as Marco, grumbling, finally turned and stalked off. Only after the door shut did Jackson relax. "You didn't have to do that," Alan murmured. Jackson looked at him. "Yes, I did." Alan felt his heart do something dangerous. That night, Alan didn't go to his wing. He walked down the hallway, barefoot and quiet, and knocked softly on Jackson's door. There was a pause, then the quiet click of the lock turning. Jackson sat by the fireplace, reading. He looked up as Alan stepped in. "Am I interrupting?" Jackson shook his head. "No. I was hoping you'd come." Alan hesitated for only a second, then walked over and sat beside him, their knees barely touching. The warmth from the fire didn't compare to the heat building between them. Jackson looked at him like he was trying to memorize every feature. "You're really staying?" Alan nodded. "I can't pretend I don't care anymore." A long, quiet beat. Jackson reached for his hand. "Neither can I." They didn't need to say more. The fire crackled beside them. The storm outside had passed, and Alan, for the first time since stepping onto the estate, didn't feel like an outsider anymore. He felt like he'd come home. Chapter 5. A storm, a fire, a choice. The wind began howling just after sunset, dragging dark clouds over the cliffs like a shroud. Alan stood at the window in Jackson's room, watching waves crash against the rocks below, the sky swallowing the last of the daylight. "Storm's coming," he said softly. Jackson glanced up from his book. "This house has stood for over 2 centuries. I think it can handle a little weather." Alan turned to him with a dry smile. "And what about you? Think you can handle it?" Jackson smirked, but his eyes flickered toward the window. "Only if the power doesn't go out." As if summoned by the words, the lights flickered once, then again, then died. Total darkness swallowed the room, broken only by a flash of lightning and the low moan of the wind outside. Alan sighed. "That was dramatic." Jackson was already moving, wheeling himself toward the dresser. "Candles are in the second drawer. Matches in the top." Alan struck a match and lit the first candle. Its warm glow trembled as if nervous to be here. "That's better," he said. Then the alarm shrieked. A high-pitched wail echoed through the halls, mechanical and urgent. Smoke. Fire. Alan's heart dropped. "West Wing," Jackson said instantly, voice sharp. "That's where Thomas used to keep his office. Electrical panels run through there." Alan didn't hesitate. "We need to get out." Jackson turned toward the hallway and pressed the elevator button beside the door. Nothing. Power was out. "You're not using that," Alan snapped, grabbing the handles of Jackson's chair. "I can get down the stairs." "No, you can't. I'm not leaving you." Smoke was already creeping under the door when Alan shoved it open, dragging Jackson into the hallway. The scent of burning wood and something chemical hit him hard. Heat pressed against them like an unseen hand. "Cover your mouth," Alan ordered, wrapping his shirt over his nose and grabbing a spare scarf from the coat rack for Jackson. "We're heading for the greenhouse. It's farthest from the fire." Jackson didn't argue. They moved fast. Alan pushing, Jackson directing, both coughing as smoke thickened around them. Flames licked down the far hallway, spitting embers like angry bees. Alan's legs trembled, but he didn't stop. Not once. The greenhouse loomed like salvation at the end of the garden path. Rain pelted the glass ceiling, drowning the world in water and thunder. Alan kicked open the heavy door and wheeled Jackson inside, collapsing beside him with a gasp. They were soaked, coughing, clothes singed at the edges, but they were alive. "I think I just carried you out of a burning building," Alan wheezed. Jackson looked at him, eyes wide, stunned. "You did. You better be flattered." Jackson laughed, breathless and raw. "I am." The rain hammered down, a symphony of chaos above them. The glass fogged. The plants around them stood untouched, quiet in their own world. Alan wiped ash from his face and looked at Jackson, who sat still, eyes glistening. "Why would you do that?" Jackson asked, voice low. "Why risk everything?" Alan blinked. "Because I couldn't lose you. Isn't it obvious?" Jackson stared at him, then looked away. "I don't deserve that. You don't get to decide what you deserve, Jackson. I don't know how to be good at this. Then let's be bad at it together." Silence fell. Rain softened. Jackson's voice broke the quiet. "I'm in love with you." Alan froze. "I tried not to be," Jackson continued, eyes shining. "I tried so hard, but you're everywhere now. In my morning coffee, in the library, in every goddamn breath I take. You make me want to be more than this broken shell." Alan leaned in, brushing wet hair from Jackson's forehead. "I wake up every morning wanting to hate this place," he whispered. "But you ruin that for me." Jackson's lips curved, just barely. "You ruin a lot of things for me, too." Then Alan kissed him. Not careful, not shy. It was the kind of kiss that demanded answers and offered none. Jackson leaned into it, hands gripping Alan's soaked shirt, and Alan sank into the warmth of his mouth, his skin, his breath. There was urgency, need, a raw ache between them neither could name. They didn't stop at the kiss. Clothes remained, but barriers didn't. Their touches were slow and deliberate, more comforting than claiming. Alan pulled Jackson against him on the greenhouse bench, wrapping his arms around him, and Jackson buried his face into Alan's neck like he was finally allowed to rest. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When they finally drifted into sleep, the storm still raged beyond the glass, but inside the greenhouse, everything was calm. By dawn, the fire had been contained. The west wing was scorched, smoke damaged and blackened, windows shattered, halls blistered with soot. But the rest of the house remained, shaken but standing, and the garden? Unharmed. Alan stepped into the foyer, still damp from the greenhouse, soot smudged along his temple, and found Mrs. Dahlia waiting with tearful eyes in a blanket. "You brought him out?" she asked. Alan nodded. "He's safe." She clutched his hand, squeezed it once, then went to tend to the others. Alan returned to Jackson's room, expecting to find him asleep. Instead, he found something else entirely. Jackson was standing, not fully, not confidently. One hand gripped the edge of the bed, one leg trembling beneath him, the other slightly raised off the footrest. But he was upright, and Alan stopped breathing. "You?" Alan started, stunned. Jackson looked at him, sheepish. "I've been doing rehab. Secretly. I didn't want you to know, in case I failed." Alan stepped forward, slowly. "You idiot," he said, voice cracking. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to be your project." Alan shook his head and grabbed Jackson's hands. "You're not. You're my choice." Jackson faltered, but didn't fall. Alan helped him sit again, their foreheads pressed together, and for a long moment they just stayed like that, half broken, half whole, fully theirs. Outside, the rain eased. Light poured in through the windows. And inside the heart of the ruined house, something new had begun to grow. Chapter 6. I Wake Up Grateful Now. 6 weeks had passed since the fire. The mansion had shifted, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Where once there had been hollow halls and locked doors, now sunlight streamed through newly installed windows, laughter echoed against polished stone, and the scent of blooming roses drifted in from the revived garden. The west wing remained cordoned off, charred remnants of a past that no longer defined them. But the rest of the estate, it breathed again. Alan's paintings lined the walls now. Large, bold, vibrant pieces that clashed with the mansion's old, somber personality. But that was the point. Color had returned. Life had returned. And so had Jackson. Alan found him most mornings in the garden, where the wild flowers had started claiming territory again. He would sit in the sunlight with a sketchbook or a book in hand, nodding politely to the few staff who now treated him not like a ghost. But a man returned from the grave. The air around him had changed. The bitterness, the weight, it hadn't vanished, but it no longer led. He looked like someone rediscovering what it meant to want more. Today was different. Today marked exactly 1 year since the contract had been signed. A year since Alan had arrived at the estate with a suitcase and a bitter heart. A year since a marriage neither of them had wanted. They'd started calling it their not a real anniversary, a joke born out of denial, affection, and everything in between. But when Alan stepped into the garden that morning, something stopped him cold. Jackson was standing, not with a cane, not against a wall, on his own, wobbly, a bit stiff, but upright, facing the arch where they'd said their vows in silence. Alan's heart clenched. Jackson turned, slowly, a triumphant smirk pulling at his mouth. "Don't just stand there. I've been practicing this all week." Alan crossed the space between them in a rush, hands outstretched, ready to steady him if he swayed. "You absolute maniac. You were supposed to tell me before trying something like this." "And miss the look on your face?" Jackson whispered. "Never." Alan grinned, brushing a kiss against Jackson's cheek. "Show off. I have to keep you impressed. You married me for my money, after all." Alan snorted. "Actually, I married you for the sarcasm." Jackson sat back down slowly, the strain visible, but his pride undimmed. "Then I've certainly delivered." That afternoon, the estate hosted a small garden party, a quiet celebration under the budding cherry trees, with white tablecloths and mismatched chairs, and food that Alan and Mrs. Dahlia had insisted on cooking themselves. Mrs. Dahlia wore a soft blue dress and cried quietly into her apron when Jackson toasted the gathering. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "And to unexpected endings that weren't endings at all." Claire was there too, surprisingly civil, surprisingly quiet. She brought a potted orchid and handed it to Alan with a half smile. "I was wrong about you," she said. Alan accepted the plant and returned her smile. "Most people are." Thomas, of course, was not in attendance. After Alan and Jackson had confronted him, with the help of several very efficient lawyers, he'd slithered off into whatever hole men like him disappeared into when their influence dried up. The estate was legally Jackson's again, fully, completely, publicly, which made what happened next all the more meaningful. As the sun began to dip into the sea, painting the sky with soft purples and golds, Jackson rolled up beside Alan and took his hand. He didn't ask. He didn't announce. He just stood, slowly, shakily, and pulled Alan in for a kiss. In front of everyone. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't performative. It was a promise. Alan's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. He kissed Jackson back with all the quiet certainty of a man who no longer cared who saw his heart. And around them, applause broke out. Awkward, genuine, sweet. Jackson whispered against his lips, "Not a transaction, not anymore." Alan squeezed his hand. Was never just that. That night, the garden was quiet again. The guests had gone. The dishes were washed. The stars had begun their slow parade across the inky sky. Alan lay on the soft grass beneath the tallest tree in the wild garden, sketchbook in his lap, pencil in hand. Jackson reclined beside him, head resting against Alan's thigh, fingers laced with his. "Don't move," Alan said, eyes narrowed. "You're being majestic." "As I'm serious. Your profile is doing this brooding, wind-swept thing. Very Byronic." Jackson chuckled. "You're impossible. You love it." "I do." The pencil scratched softly as Alan worked. The greenhouse glowed faintly in the distance, lit from within. The moonlight shimmered on the garden pond. The air smelled of night blossoms and rain-kissed soil. Jackson turned his head slightly, still watching the sky. "I thought I was ruined," he murmured. "After Caleb. After the accident. After everything. I thought there was nothing left of me worth saving." Alan looked down at him, heart tight. "But you didn't try to fix me," Jackson continued. "You just made the ruins feel like home." Alan leaned down, brushing a soft kiss against Jackson's forehead. "You were never ruined," he whispered. "You were just waiting." They stayed there until the air grew cool and the stars burned brighter. Alan didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke in their shared bed the next morning, sunlight already streaming through the windows, Jackson's arm was draped across his waist, and his steady breathing hummed against Alan's neck. Alan stared at the ceiling for a long moment, overwhelmed by how peaceful it felt to simply be. To be safe, to be wanted, to be home. He smiled, turning just enough to press his lips against Jackson's shoulder. He had walked into this house angry, scared, and resentful. But now he woke up grateful. Because somehow, against every odd, this twisted, broken arrangement had given him the love of his life, and he would choose it 1,000 times over. Chapter 1. Bound by Chains of Family Duty. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of lavender from the garden outside my window. It was a cruel juxtaposition to the storm raging inside me. My father's words from the night before still echoed in my mind. "Alexander, this isn't a request. This marriage is happening." I stared at the mirror, adjusting the silk tie that seemed to tighten like a noose around my neck. My reflection offered no solace, just the face of a man being dragged into a life he didn't choose. My light brown hair was perfectly coiffed, my dark green eyes framed by faint shadows from a sleepless night. I looked the part of a groom, but inside I was anything but ready. The knock on the door was hesitant, as if even the person on the other side knew how unwelcome they were at this moment. My younger sister, Ellie, peeked in. "Alex," she said softly, stepping into the room. Her delicate features were marred by concern. "Are you okay? Do I look okay?" I asked, my voice tinged with bitterness I immediately regretted. Ellie didn't deserve that. She walked over and placed a comforting hand on my arm. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but maybe it won't be so bad. Marcus is—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Cold, distant, possibly incapable of basic human emotion?" I supplied. She sighed. "I was going to say successful. He's a good businessman, Alex. He'll stabilize the company." Ah, yes, the company. The almighty Vale Enterprises, the lifeblood of our family for 3 generations. Or at least it had been, until bad investments and poor decisions left it teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The solution? An arranged marriage to Marcus Everhart, the enigmatic CEO of Everhart Industries, whose wealth and influence could pull us back from the brink. A match made in boardroom heaven, if not in personal hell. Does Dad even care that he's marrying me off like some pawn in a corporate game? I muttered, brushing imaginary lint from my jacket. Ellie hesitated, her silence answering for her. He cares, she finally said, her voice uncertain. In his own way. I didn't respond. What was the point? This was happening, whether I liked it or not. I'd signed the papers. I'd agreed to the terms. And now, in a few hours, I'd be Alexander Everhart, husband to a man I barely knew. The wedding venue was breathtaking, a stark contrast to the dread pooling in my chest. White roses adorned every surface, and chandeliers cast a golden glow over the grand hall. The guests, a veritable who's who of the business elite, chatted and laughed, oblivious to the tension radiating from me. I stood at the altar, waiting for Marcus to arrive. My palms were clammy, despite the coolness of the air, and I resisted the urge to tug at my tie. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the minutes crawling by as if to prolong my torment. When Marcus finally entered, the room fell silent. He commanded attention effortlessly, his tall, imposing figure cutting through the crowd like a knife. His dark hair was immaculately styled, and his piercing gray eyes scanned the room with cool detachment. He moved with the confidence of a man who owned not just the room, but the world. He approached the altar with a measured stride, his face unreadable. For a moment, his eyes met mine, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite identify. Curiosity? Fear? Maybe both. He gave a curt nod, and I responded with an awkward smile that felt more like a grimace. The ceremony began, the officiant's voice a dull hum in the background as my thoughts spiraled. I barely registered the words until it was time for the vows. "Do you, Alexander Vale, take Marcus Everhart to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant asked. I hesitated, my gaze flickering to Marcus. His expression remained stoic, as if this were just another business transaction. Swallowing hard, I forced the words out. "I do." "And do you, Marcus Everhart, take Alexander Vale to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," he said, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. With that, we were pronounced married. The applause was polite, the smiles around us practiced. Marcus extended his hand toward me, and I hesitated before placing mine in his. His grip was firm, almost unyielding, and as we turned to face the crowd, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd just gotten myself into. The reception was a blur of handshakes and forced smiles. Marcus was the perfect gentleman, introducing me to his associates with cool politeness. But every interaction felt rehearsed, every gesture calculated. At one point, I escaped to the balcony, desperate for a moment to breathe. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and I leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights. "You're already running away from your own wedding?" The deep voice startled me, and I turned to find Marcus standing behind me. He looked as composed as ever, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit. "I needed air," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "This isn't a prison sentence, Alexander. You might as well try to make the best of it." I bristled at his words. "Forgive me if I'm not jumping for joy at being married off like a bargaining chip." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe? We both agreed to this. It benefits both our families. "That doesn't mean I have to like it," I shot back. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us palpable. Finally, he broke the silence. "You'll find your room upstairs. Third door on the left. I'll be in my study if you need anything." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the balcony. I clenched the railing, my frustration bubbling over. How could someone so handsome be so infuriatingly cold? The bedroom was as impersonal as the rest of the mansion. Large, immaculate, and utterly devoid of warmth. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase I hadn't yet unpacked. This was my life now. Married to a man who barely looked at me, living in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wouldn't cry. Not tonight. As the hours ticked by, I realized Marcus wasn't coming to bed. A quick glance at the clock showed it was well past midnight. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers. But another part, the louder part, was too drained to care. I curled up under the thick comforter, staring at the empty side of the bed. For better or worse, this was the beginning of my new life. And God help me, I had no idea how I was going to survive it. Chapter 2. A House Divided. Waking up in Marcus Everhart's mansion was like stepping into a painting. Beautiful, pristine, and completely lifeless. The high ceilings and grand windows filled the room with sunlight, but it did little to warm the coldness of the space. Even the bed I'd slept in, an oversized, luxurious thing with silk sheets, felt like it belonged to someone else. I didn't belong here. The reality of my situation hit me hard as I made my way downstairs. The staff, all impeccably dressed and eerily quiet, nodded politely but kept their distance. The house was too quiet, save for the soft click of my shoes against the marble floors. I wandered aimlessly until I found the dining room, where breakfast was already laid out on the long, polished table. Fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee were arranged with precision, as though a photographer might walk in at any moment to capture the perfect shot. Marcus was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a tablet in his hand. He looked up briefly when I entered, his gray eyes giving nothing away. "Good morning," he said, his voice as neutral as ever. "Morning," I replied, taking a seat far enough from him to make it clear I wasn't eager for conversation. We ate in silence, the only sounds coming from the clink of silverware and the occasional rustle of Marcus turning a page on his tablet. I tried to focus on my food, but my appetite had vanished. Every bite felt like swallowing a stone. Finally, I broke the silence. "So is this how it's going to be? Silent breakfasts and avoiding each other until one of us dies?" Marcus's gaze flicked up, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't aware you wanted a conversation. You've seemed uncomfortable." "Gee, I wonder why," I said, unable to keep the sarcasm from my voice. "Maybe it's because I was forced into a marriage I didn't ask for, with someone who treats me like a business acquisition." His jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his otherwise flawless mask. "I didn't ask for this either, Alexander, but we made an agreement. It benefits both of us, so I suggest you focus on that." "Benefits?" I repeated, my voice rising. "The only one benefiting here is my father, who gets to keep his precious company afloat. I didn't agree to live in a museum with a man who can't even look me in the eye for more than 5 seconds. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "If you don't like it, you're free to leave. But don't expect your family to survive the fallout." The words hit me like a slap. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking. "You might be fine living in your icy little bubble, but I'm not. I refuse to spend the rest of my life like this." Before he could respond, I turned and walked out, my chest tight with frustration. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that room another second. The rest of the day passed in a haze of restless wandering. The mansion was a labyrinth of grand hallways, ornate furniture, and rooms that felt more like displays than living spaces. It was all so perfect, so sterile, and it only deepened the ache in my chest. Eventually, I stumbled upon a library. Unlike the rest of the house, it had a lived-in feel, with books stacked haphazardly on the shelves and a faint scent of leather and parchment in the air. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast a warm glow on the dark wood furniture, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt a flicker of comfort. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, marveling at the range of titles. Philosophy, business, history, even poetry. It was an eclectic collection, and I couldn't help but wonder if it reflected Marcus's hidden depths. One book caught my eye, a worn leather journal tucked between 2 thick volumes. I hesitated before pulling it out, feeling a twinge of guilt for prying. But curiosity won out, and I opened it to find pages filled with handwritten notes. The handwriting was neat and precise, but there was an unexpected warmth to it, as though the writer had poured their soul onto the page. Flipping through, I saw sketches of landscapes, fragments of poetry, and even a few personal musings. One entry in particular caught my attention. "Sometimes I wonder if the walls I've built around myself are keeping others out, or trapping me inside. Trust is a luxury I can't afford anymore, but the loneliness is unbearable." I stared at the words, my heart twisting. Was this Marcus's? It didn't match the man I'd met, the man who seemed incapable of vulnerability. But then again, maybe it did. Maybe this was the part of him he kept hidden, even from himself. Enjoying yourself? I jumped, nearly dropping the journal. Marcus stood in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. I? My face burned as I struggled for an explanation. I didn't mean to. He held up a hand, cutting me off. It's fine, he said, walking into the room. That's an old journal. I forgot it was even here. His tone was casual, but there was a tension in his posture that betrayed him. He took the journal from my hands and placed it back on the shelf, his movements slow and deliberate. Why do you keep it? I asked before I could stop myself. He glanced at me, his gray eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. Sometimes it's good to remember who you used to be, he said quietly, even if you don't want to be that person anymore. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment, the distance between us felt smaller, like we were two people trying to understand each other instead of two strangers forced into a marriage. But just as quickly, the moment passed. Marcus straightened, his mask slipping back into place. Dinner will be served at 7, he said, his tone cool once more. Don't be late. And with that, he left, leaving me alone in the library. That night, I sat in my room, replaying the day's events in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing in the library, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Vulnerability? Regret? Whatever it was, it made me wonder if there was more to him than I'd given him credit for. But even if there was, did it matter? We were two people, bound by duty, not love. And yet a small, stubborn part of me couldn't help but hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to bridge the divide between us. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Ice. The sound of distant thunder echoed through the mansion as rain streaked the windows, blurring the manicured gardens outside. A storm was brewing, not just in the skies, but between Marcus and me. Living with him was like navigating a minefield. Every interaction felt like it could detonate into silence or simmering tension. This morning had been no different. Marcus had left the breakfast table without a word after a curt nod in my direction. The chill of his absence lingered long after he was gone. I pushed the untouched food around on my plate, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It wasn't just his cold demeanor that gnawed at me. It was the way I kept catching glimpses of something more. Like the flicker of warmth in his eyes when he let his guard down, if only for a second. I found myself wandering the house again, as I often did when Marcus was absent or locked away in his study. The mansion felt less intimidating now, though its grandeur still didn't feel like home. I ended up back in the library, the one place that seemed to offer solace. I curled up in one of the plush chairs near the window, a book in hand. It was a novel I'd found on the lower shelf, a romance of all things. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wasn't sure how long I'd been reading when the door creaked open and Marcus stepped inside. He paused when he saw me, his expression shifting from surprise to something more neutral. I didn't realize you were in here, he said, his tone flat but not unfriendly. Sorry, I replied, sitting up a little straighter. I can leave if you need the space. He hesitated, then shook his head. Stay. It's your house, too. The words felt awkward, like he wasn't used to saying them. He crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite mine. For a moment, we sat in silence, the storm outside providing the only soundtrack. I could feel his eyes on me occasionally, though he never said anything. Finally, I broke the quiet. Do you read much? I asked, holding up my book. He glanced at it and then at the shelves surrounding us. I used to. Not as much anymore. Why not? He hesitated, his gaze distant. Life gets in the way. Priorities shift. There was something wistful in his voice, and I seized the opportunity to dig deeper. What did you like to read? Philosophy, mostly. History, sometimes poetry. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his lips. My mother loved poetry. She used to recite it when I was a kid. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family. I leaned forward, intrigued. She sounds wonderful. She was, he said softly. She passed away when I was 16. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the loss. It was a long time ago. We fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Less like two strangers sharing a space, and more like two people trying to connect. I watched as Marcus leaned back in his chair, his posture more relaxed than I'd ever seen it. For the first time, he seemed human. Later that week, the tension between us thawed further during a charity gala Marcus had insisted we attend. He hadn't given me much choice in the matter, but as the evening unfolded, I found myself grateful for the opportunity to see him in a different light. The event was hosted in a sprawling ballroom filled with chandeliers and people dressed to the nines. Marcus and I arrived together, arm in arm, presenting the image of a perfect couple. I'd expected him to treat me like a prop, but instead, he surprised me. He introduced me to his colleagues with genuine pride in his voice, as though he wanted them to know who I was, not just as his spouse, but as a person. As the night went on, I noticed how people gravitated toward him. His sharp wit and calm confidence made him a magnet for attention, yet he never seemed entirely at ease. It was in the quieter moments when he thought no one was watching that I saw the cracks. A slight tension in his jaw, a fleeting glance toward the exit. He wasn't as invulnerable as he wanted the world to believe. The highlight of the night came when the band started playing a slow waltz. Marcus turned to me, his gray eyes meeting mine. "Shall we?" I blinked, caught off guard. "You want to dance?" "It's expected," he said, though his lips twitched in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely averse to the idea. I placed my hand in his and he led me to the dance floor. The room seemed to blur around us as he guided me with practiced ease. His hand on my waist was firm but not overbearing, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, sent a shiver down my spine. "You're a good dancer," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "So are you," he replied, "though I suspect you're better at leading." I laughed softly, and for a moment we were just two people sharing a dance. No arranged marriage, no icy walls, just the warmth of his hand in mine and the rhythm of the music carrying us along. That night, back at the mansion, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Marcus had held me on the dance floor. There had been something electric in the air between us, something I couldn't quite name. It left me restless, pacing my room long after midnight. Eventually, I found myself in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound until a voice broke the silence. "Can't sleep." I turned to see Marcus standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair slightly tousled. He looked softer, more approachable. "Something like that," I said, setting the glass down. "You?" he shrugged. "Late nights are a habit." I hesitated, then gestured toward the small table in the corner. "Want to sit?" To my surprise, he nodded and joined me. We sat across from each other, the quiet intimacy of the moment feeling strangely comforting. "You surprised me tonight," I admitted. "How so?" "You weren't cold." I smiled faintly. "It was nice." His lips quirked in a small smile. "I could say the same about you." We fell into an easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his childhood, his love for the outdoors, and how he used to spend summers hiking with his mother. I shared stories of my chaotic family, including Ellie's latest antics. For the first time, it felt like we were truly seeing each other. When the conversation lulled, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Alexander, you have a way of making people feel seen." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. "I could say the same about you," I replied softly. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the distance between us shrinking in ways I hadn't thought possible. And though neither of us said it, I knew we'd taken a step closer to something real, something worth fighting for. Chapter 4: Hearts on Fire. The morning after our midnight conversation, something shifted between Marcus and me. It wasn't monumental, there were no grand declarations or sudden epiphanies, but the air around us felt lighter, less strained. We weren't two strangers forced to coexist anymore. There was a tentative connection, fragile but real, and it gave me a sliver of hope. I found myself spending more time in the library, where Marcus would occasionally join me, always with a book in hand. At first, we didn't talk much, but his presence alone was a comfort. Slowly, though, our silences grew shorter, filled instead with quiet conversations about the books we were reading or the latest business news. It felt natural, almost easy, and I clung to those moments like a lifeline. One afternoon, as rain pattered against the windows, I found Marcus at his desk in the study. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I lingered in the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt, but he looked up and waved me in. "Come in," he said, his voice softer than usual. I could use a break. I stepped inside, noting the cluttered desk, a rare departure from his usual precision. Busy day? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. You could say that. One of my major clients is being difficult, and it's taking all my energy to keep them on board. Can I help? The words tumbled out before I could think them through. He raised an eyebrow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Do you even know what I do? Not really, I admitted, flushing slightly. But I'm a quick learner. He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. I appreciate the offer, but this isn't something you can help with. I hesitated, then said, maybe I can't help with the work, but I can help with this. I gestured to the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. You need a break. He regarded me for a moment as if weighing his options before finally nodding. You're right. What do you suggest? That evening, I turned one of the unused rooms into a makeshift retreat. I'd stumbled across it earlier in the week, a small, cozy space with a fireplace and a large window overlooking the garden. It was dusty and unused, but it had potential. With the help of some of the staff, I added soft blankets, candles, and a few of Marcus's favorite books from the library. It wasn't much, but it was something personal, something warm. When I led Marcus into the room, his eyes widened slightly. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around, taking it all in. Finally, he turned to me. You did this? I nodded, suddenly nervous. I thought you might need a place to unwind, somewhere that feels less like a museum. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. Not the polite practice smile I'd seen at the gala, but something real and unguarded. Thank you, Alexander. This means more than you know. We spent the evening in that room, talking by the fire as the storm raged outside. Marcus opened up in a way I hadn't expected, sharing stories about his mother and the summers they'd spent together in a cabin by the lake. He spoke of his love for hiking and how he'd stopped going after she passed. There was a sadness in his voice, but also a hint of gratitude, as if remembering her brought him peace. In turn, I told him about my family, about Ellie's mischievous pranks, my father's obsession with the company, and my own struggles to find my place in the world. He listened intently, his gray eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time I felt truly seen. The first kiss happened a week later, during one of our now regular arguments. It started over something trivial, I can't even remember what, but it quickly escalated as our fights often did. You can't keep shutting me out, Marcus, I shouted, my frustration boiling over. You let me in just enough to make me care, and then you slam the door in my face. Do you even know how exhausting that is? He stood across the room, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold indifference. I didn't ask you to care, Alexander. This marriage was never supposed to be about feelings. Well, guess what? I do care. The words exploded out of me, raw and unfiltered. And it's not because of this stupid marriage or our families or any of that. It's because I see you, the real you, and I care about that man, whether you like it or not. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and stormy. Then, before I could process what was happening, he crossed the room in 3 swift strides and pulled me into a kiss. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce, almost desperate, as though he'd been holding back for far too long. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the world around us seemed to blur. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to let someone in without losing myself. Then we'll figure it out together, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. You don't have to do it alone. From that moment on, everything changed. The walls Marcus had built around himself didn't crumble overnight, but they began to crack, piece by piece. He let me in more often, sharing parts of himself he'd kept hidden for years. In turn, I let myself fall for him completely, no longer holding back out of fear or doubt. One night, as we lay together in bed, he traced patterns on my arm with his fingertips. You're the first person who's made me feel like I'm not broken, he said softly. Like maybe I deserve something good. You do, I whispered, placing a kiss on his forehead. You deserve everything good. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of intimacy, cooking together in the kitchen, sharing coffee on the balcony, and even sneaking away from a business meeting to explore a hidden garden he'd discovered as a child. Each moment brought us closer, and the mansion that had once felt cold and unwelcoming now felt alive with warmth and laughter. For the first time in years, Marcus smiled freely, his laughter filling the spaces that had once been silent. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I'd found where I truly belonged. We didn't say it out loud right away, but I knew we were both falling in love. It was in the way he held my hand when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes softened whenever they met mine, and when he finally said the words, "One quiet evening as the sun set over the garden," I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. "I love you, Alexander," he said, his voice steady and sure. I smiled, my heart full to bursting. "I love you too, Marcus. Always." The kiss that followed was slow and tender, a promise of all the good things yet to come. For the first time, the fire between us wasn't one of anger or frustration. It was pure, unfiltered love. Chapter 5. Trials of Love. The mansion had finally started to feel like home. The once empty halls now echoed with laughter, quiet conversations, and shared moments. Marcus and I had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural, even comforting. But as much as I wanted to believe we'd reached the end of our struggles, life wasn't about to let us off that easily. It started with a phone call. Marcus was in his study when his assistant, Claire, called. I could hear the tension in his voice even from the next room. He paced as he spoke, his tone clipped, the calm exterior he'd mastered beginning to crack. When he hung up, he didn't come out. Hours passed, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing worry in my chest. I found him still at his desk, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. His tie was loosened, and the normally pristine desk was cluttered with papers and files. "Marcus?" I said softly, stepping inside. He didn't look up. "Not now, Alexander." "That's not how this works anymore," I said, closing the door behind me. "Talk to me." He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "One of my largest contracts is on the verge of collapse. If it falls through, it could cost Everhart Industries millions. Maybe more." "Is it something we can fix?" I asked, moving closer. "We," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, we," I said firmly. "I'm your husband, Marcus. We're in this together." He studied me for a moment, his gray eyes softening. "It's complicated. The client feels we've failed to meet their expectations, but it's not true. This is sabotage. Someone's feeding them misinformation, but I haven't figured out who yet." "Then let me help," I said. "Two heads are better than one, right?" He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded. "Let's figure this out." The next few days were a whirlwind. Marcus and I pored over documents, contracts, and emails, searching for the source of the problem. It was exhausting, but we worked well together. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed being part of his world, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. Late one night, as we sat side by side in the study, my head drooping from exhaustion, Marcus reached over and placed a hand on mine. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd manage," I replied with a tired smile. "But I'm glad you don't have to." For a moment, we just sat there, the warmth of his hand grounding me. It was in moments like this that I realized how much he'd come to mean to me. He wasn't just the man I'd been forced to marry. He was my partner, my equal, my everything. Just as we were making progress, another complication arose. A familiar face appeared at the mansion one afternoon, uninvited and unwelcome. Sebastian. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and oozing charm. His presence immediately set me on edge. I'd heard of him before, an old flame of Marcus's who had left under less than ideal circumstances. Seeing him now, with his smug smile and overfamiliar attitude, made my blood boil. "Marcus," Sebastian drawled as he stepped into the study. "It's been too long." Marcus stood, his expression guarded. "Sebastian, what are you doing here?" "I heard about your little predicament," Sebastian said, his eyes flicking to me briefly before returning to Marcus. "Thought I'd offer my assistance, for old time's sake." "We don't need your help," I said before I could stop myself. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. Sebastian's gaze settled on me, his smile widening. "Ah, you must be Alexander, the new husband. Marcus has excellent taste as always." I crossed my arms, refusing to be drawn into his game. And you must be the ex who doesn't know when to stay in the past. Marcus placed a hand on my arm, a silent plea for calm. Sebastian, I appreciate the offer, but we have everything under control. Do you? Sebastian asked, his tone dripping with false concern. Because from what I've heard, your company is on the brink of disaster. I could help, Marcus. You know I'm good at what I do. Marcus's jaw tightened. We're fine. Thank you. Sebastian lingered for a moment, his gaze darting between us. Then, with a shrug, he said, Suit yourself, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me. As soon as he was gone, I rounded on Marcus. Why didn't you tell me he'd show up? I didn't know, he said, his voice low. He's unpredictable. Unpredictable? He was practically circling you like a vulture. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. Alexander, I don't want Sebastian. I haven't wanted him in years. I hesitated, his words soothing some of my frustration. Then why didn't you shut him down more firmly? Because he thrives on conflict, Marcus explained. Giving him a reaction would have made things worse. I let out a breath, my anger fading. I trust you, Marcus. I don't like the way he looks at you. He stepped closer, his hands settling on my shoulders. The only person I care about is you, he said, his voice steady. Don't let him come between us. I nodded, leaning into his touch. I won't. In the end, it was Marcus who uncovered the truth. One of his competitors had been feeding false information to the client, hoping to sabotage the contract. Armed with the evidence, Marcus and I presented a united front, confronting the client and setting the record straight. It wasn't easy, but we won them back. The relief on Marcus's face when the deal was secured was palpable. He pulled me into a tight embrace, his voice thick with emotion. We did it, he said. No, I corrected, smiling against his chest. You did it. I just helped. You did more than that, he said, pulling back to look at me. You believed in me when I was ready to give up. I couldn't have done this without you. That night, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the garden, Marcus took my hand in his. I've spent so much of my life pushing people away, he said, his voice soft. I thought it was the only way to protect myself. But then you came along, and you changed everything. You let me in, I said. That's what changed everything. He smiled, his gray eyes warm. I love you, Alexander, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I leaned forward to kiss him. It was a kiss filled with all the things we couldn't put into words. Love, gratitude, hope. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against his. I love you too, I whispered. Always. The storm that had loomed over us was gone, replaced by the steady warmth of the life we were building together. And for the first time I knew that no matter what challenges came our way, we'd face them together. Epilogue, Fire and Warmth. The morning sun bathed the mansion in golden light, filtering through the windows and painting the walls in soft hues. Gone was the sterile, impersonal coldness that once defined this place. Now it felt alive, vibrant, a reflection of the love that Marcus and I had built together. It had been 6 months since the contract crisis, the chaos that tested us in ways I hadn't imagined. But looking back, I couldn't be more grateful for what we'd endured. It wasn't just a trial of Marcus's resilience or my ability to trust. It was a test of us, of the bond we'd formed in the unlikeliest of circumstances. And we had come out stronger for it. This morning was special. Today, Marcus and I were renewing our vows, not for the benefit of our families or business, but for us. It was a celebration of everything we'd overcome and everything we were becoming together. The ceremony was held in the garden, the same place I'd once looked at through the mansion's cold glass windows, thinking I'd never belong. Now, it was a sanctuary, a place where laughter and love echoed freely. Ellie had taken over most of the planning, and I had to admit she'd outdone herself. White and gold roses adorned the trellises, and soft string lights hung between the trees, casting a warm glow even in daylight. The guest list was small this time, just family and a few close friends. My father was there, beaming with pride in a way I hadn't seen in years. Ellie gave me a conspiratorial wink as I passed her, and I smiled, grateful for her support. Claire, Marcus's assistant, sat near the front, looking uncharacteristically relaxed as she chatted with one of the Everhart board members. Even Marcus's old mentor, a gruff but kind man named Harold, had made the trip. And then there was Marcus. He stood at the altar, waiting for me. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, as always, but there was something different about him today. His usually guarded expression was nowhere to be found. Instead, he looked at me with warmth, his gray eyes reflecting the fire that had sparked between us and never faded. As I walked toward him, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. I could hear the faint hum of music, the murmur of the guests, but all I really saw was him. When I reached the altar, he took my hands in his, and the touch sent a familiar jolt through me, a mixture of love, comfort, and the thrilling awareness that this was my person, my Marcus. The officiant began, but this time it wasn't a formality. Every word carried meaning, every moment was deliberate. When it was time for us to speak our vows, Marcus went first. "Alexander," he began, his voice steady but soft, "the day I married you, I thought I was making a sacrifice for duty. What I didn't realize was that I was gaining everything I never knew I needed. You broke through walls I'd spent years building, and in doing so, you gave me back pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. I love you, and I promise to keep loving you, not just on the easy days, but on the hard ones too. You've taught me that love isn't something to fear, it's something to fight for. And I will fight for us, always." There was a lump in my throat as he finished, and I could see the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. My hands tightened on his, a silent reassurance that I felt the same. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath, letting my words flow from the heart. "Marcus," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "when we stood at this altar the first time, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know you, not really. But what I've learned is that beneath the calm, collected exterior is a man who loves deeply, who protects fiercely, and who gives more than he thinks he does. You've shown me that love isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. You're my partner, my best friend, my safe place. I promise to stand by you, to fight for you, and to love you for the rest of my life." There were tears in my eyes as I finished, but I didn't care. Marcus reached up, brushing one away with his thumb, and the look in his eyes made my chest ache with the weight of how much I loved him. When the officiant pronounced us bound together once more, Marcus didn't wait. He pulled me into a kiss, and the world seemed to melt away. It wasn't the hesitant kiss of our wedding day or the desperate kiss of our first argument. It was a kiss filled with certainty, with love, with the promise of forever. The guests erupted into cheers, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was the man in front of me, the life we'd built together, and the future we had yet to create. The reception was a blur of laughter and joy. Ellie gave a toast that had everyone in stitches, recounting some of my less-than-graceful moments growing up. Harold offered a gruff but heartfelt speech about how Marcus had become not just a great businessman, but a great man. Even my father stood up to speak, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked Marcus for the way he'd supported not just me, but our family. But the moment that stayed with me most came later in the evening, when Marcus and I slipped away from the crowd to catch our breath. We found ourselves back in the garden, under the string lights that now glowed softly in the dusk. "This feels familiar," Marcus said, his lips curving into a small smile. "It does," I replied, leaning against him. "Except this time, it's real." He tilted my chin up, his gray eyes searching mine. "It's always been real, Alexander. I just didn't realize it at first." His words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I leaned into his embrace, letting myself savor the quiet moment. The air was cool, the scent of roses lingering in the breeze, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. "I love you," he said, his voice low but firm. "I love you too," I whispered, my heart full. We stayed there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the sounds of the party drifted through the garden. It was a moment I knew I'd carry with me forever, a reminder of how far we'd come, of the fire and warmth we'd found together. And as we stood there, the mansion behind us and the world ahead, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of our story. Together, we could face anything.